Chapter 2013. Hearing Luo Fan's words and looking at the pitch-black vortex in front of him, the old man was in disbelief at first, but he soon became extremely excited. Although he felt that it was child's play for a vortex like this to be able to transcend this world, his vague premonition told him that Luo Fan was right. This was the opportunity for him to transcend this world. Moreover, there was no reason for Luo Fan to lie to him. Initially, no matter what he did, even if he toyed with their wills, he would always remain calm. He really did not seem like someone who would lie to others. Immediately, he moved, and boundless power erupted from his body. The terrifying power began to distort the surrounding space-time and laws, allowing him to erupt with unimaginable power. With this power, his figure crashed straight into the pitch-black vortex. Crack. As a loud sound rang out, countless cracks appeared in the space-time where the vortex was. It looked like a huge spider web that could envelop the entire vortex had appeared out of thin air. After that, the old man's body directly passed through the crack and the vortex. He gently drilled his way out from behind the vortex. It looked as if the vortex was nothing more than an illusion and didn't exist at all. As this happened, the old man's body trembled, and sizzling sounds rang out continuously from his body. As the sounds rang out, blood splattered all over his body. The blood distorted and squirmed in midair, giving birth to miniature worlds. Very soon, they were completely destroyed by the vibrations of the laws and laws around them. In the end, they disappeared without a trace, as if they had never existed. Even innate Zenith Heaven cultivators would not be able to control their blood. Once their blood lost control, it would turn into living creatures due to its extremely high nature. For example, this old man was an existence that far surpassed the level of a supreme monarch. It was easy to imagine what kind of unbelievable changes would happen to his blood after it lost control. It was only normal for it to give birth to these miniature worlds. If there was no pressure from the laws and laws around them, these miniature worlds could even continuously absorb the vitality of the outside world and give birth to countless living creatures, cultivators, and a prosperous cultivation civilization. Of course, this was only because there was no pressure from the laws of the outside world. In this world where the rules and laws were on the same level as the great heaven and earth, the existence of any small world must be able to disregard these rules and laws in order to exist. This was equivalent to the tribulations of these small worlds. Only by going through it could he truly stabilize himself. But it was clear that the small world formed by the blood itself couldn't resist this tribulation, and it was completely formed under the pressure of the laws. Thus, the change from before occurred. However, at this moment, the old man was clearly not paying attention to this change. At this moment, there was a look of disbelief on his face. How is this possible? My ability is actually unable to break the shackles and rush in. He murmured as his expression began to fluctuate. He did not suspect that everything in front of him was an illusion. There was no such vortex at all. After all, apart from not believing that Luo Fan would lie to him, he had also vaguely come into contact with a barrier. He even felt that as long as he broke through that barrier, he would be able to step into another world, another realm. The countless cracks that had yet to completely dissipate were clear proof of this. With this feeling and understanding, he naturally understood that it was not the vortex's problem that caused him to be unable to rush into the vortex, but his own problem. Either he was not strong enough, or he had not found a way to do so. Luo Fan just looked on indifferently from the side, and did not have any intention of giving any advice or helping. For him, here, he could communicate with this world and activate this glimmer of hope. This was already extremely benevolent. As for other things, that was the matter of the cultivators in this world. This was from a logical point of view, but from a rational point of view, there was a more convincing explanation. After all, to really break into the road of Tao Master, one still needed to pass through many barriers. Which of these barriers did not require a lot of effort and wisdom to pass through? If the old man in front of him did not even have the ability to step into the passage and needed his help, then breaking through the later barriers would only be courting death. The old man had been the #1 person in this world for a long time. Naturally, he had accumulated enough arrogance. This kind of arrogance made it impossible for him to make a judgment that he was powerless at this time, and naturally, it was even more impossible for him to ask for help from Luo Fan at this time. Immediately, his figure flashed, and he returned to the vortex. He began to carefully sense the vortex in front of him, sensing the countless cracks that were gradually closing up. These cracks were cracks of the nomological laws, cracks of space-time, and behind these cracks was a kind of nothingness, but it was not the vortex at all. Therefore, it was obviously impossible to find the passage of the vortex through this kind of sensing. However, for the old man, he only carefully sensed all of this, using the wisdom that he had accumulated for who knew how many billions of years to calculate, to test, and to find a way to pass through this barrier and step into the vortex. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his eyebrows and suddenly turned his head to look at the horizon. In that direction, there was an extremely powerful aura that was rapidly approaching this location. The strength of that aura was slightly weaker than the others, but compared to the old man in front of Luo Fan at this moment, it was on par with him. However, based on the laws of this world that he could control at will, it was clear that he was not a native of this world, but a cultivator from the outside world. I didn't expect fellow Taoists to transcend and open up this world. Under the effect of the nomological laws, the cultivator quickly arrived in front of Luo Fan. This was a young man who looked to be in his mid-20s. His entire body was surrounded by a vigorous vitality, and every breath he took seemed to contain the birth and destruction of a world. As he moved, the surrounding nomological laws naturally responded to his every action and even his every thought. It seemed like wherever he went was the center of the world, the hub of the universe. "What's the matter, fellow Taoist?" Luo Fan asked calmly. The aura of this creature before him told him that he was definitely not a rogue cultivator. He was definitely not a rogue cultivator. He was most likely a high-ranking member of a certain faction. Only such an existence could accumulate such a powerful and vast aura and confidence. "I've been rude. I'm the vice sect master of the All Tribulations Gate, Nong Hong." The cultivator smiled calmly. As he spoke, there was a sense of confidence and carefreeness. In comparison, Luo Fan's calm question was like a spring breeze. Luo Fan frowned and looked at the cultivator quietly. Nong Hong saw that Luo Fan was not interested in introducing himself. He smiled and said, "Since fellow Taoist is not interested in getting to know me, it seems like there's no need to say anything else. Goodbye." With that, the cultivator turned around and left. In a flash, he disappeared from this world. Seeing the cultivator leave, Luo Fan's eyes flashed with surprise. The cultivator's decisiveness was beyond his imagination. He could actually guess that this cultivator had come here in such a manner to communicate with him, and perhaps even wanted to cooperate with him to some extent. However, he was not interested in any of this. At this moment, what he wanted was a quiet time to deal with what he had gained from the previous calamity. That was why he treated the cultivator like that. The cultivator's reaction was even more carefree. If he was a normal person, even if he knew Luo Fan's attitude, he would have tried a bit before giving up. However, the cultivator immediately changed his original plan after knowing Luo Fan's attitude. He turned around and left. This cultivator is only the vice sect master of the All Tribulations Gate. What kind of existence is the sect master? Suddenly, he could not help but feel curious. However, this kind of curiosity did not linger in his heart. He quickly threw this thought to the back of his mind and watched as the old man tried to attack the whirlpool again and again. Over the next few days, wave after wave of cultivators from the outside world entered this world and directly arrived at the top of the mountain. They met Luo Fan next to the whirlpool. Some of these cultivators appeared alone, while others appeared in groups of dozens. They were none other than individual cultivator forces. Although the details were different, in general, they wanted to cooperate with Luo Fan to build a reincarnation point in this world and leave a way out for the cultivators of their forces. The Tao Master's path was not without danger. Although Luo Fan could go to any world and carry out any plan he wanted in the first level of the Tao Master's path, he felt that the Tao Master's path was very peaceful. However, that was only because he was strong enough. In fact, for those cultivators who had just stepped into this world, even if they were supreme emperors, they could encounter danger that they could not resist at any time during a seemingly safe adventure. Their bodies and Tao would vanish, and their souls would scatter. It could be said that there were billions or even trillions of cultivators still alive in the first level of the Tao Master's path, but each cultivator had survived thousands of peers. Under such circumstances, in order to prevent themselves from never being able to reincarnate after the occurrence of danger and have a chance to start anew, after countless years and generations of cultivators, there was finally a wise person who created a method to leave a way out for cultivators. That was to find a world like the one where Luo Fan was now, where there was a glimmer of life, and leave a seed of resurrection here. Once his soul was destroyed in other places, he could naturally use the power of the world to be resurrected. Of course, any world could be chosen. However, the reason why the other worlds weren't popular, and it was this kind of world that had a chance of survival that was extremely popular, was naturally because once the other worlds were reborn, they would be trapped in that world like the old man, unable to transcend. But this kind of world with a glimmer of life was different. Although it was also imprisoned here, there was still a possibility of breaking the imprisonment and returning to the Tao Master's path. In contrast, the value of this place was self-evident. In fact, there were countless such worlds on the road to becoming a Tao Master. However, even if there were many of them, compared to the countless cultivators, they still seemed insignificant. It was not enough for every cultivator to leave a way out. Thus, it was only natural. As a result, it was occupied by a large number of forces and became the base of those forces. Understanding this, Luo Fan also vaguely understood why some of the worlds were originally the stations of a certain force, but after some war, they were abandoned by that force, even though there was not much damage. This was probably because there was a glimmer of life in those worlds. Originally, there was a glimmer of hope for survival, but due to the war or other reasons, that glimmer of hope disappeared. That was why that force gave up on it. This time, the reason why they came to find Luo Fan to cooperate was very simple. For countless years, the first level of the Tao Master's path had established a rule. A cultivator who activated a glimmer of life in a certain world would have the ownership of that world. That cultivator could transfer this ownership to others for a price, and could also establish a force of their own, to treat this world as the foundation of their force. Most of the forces on the Tao Master's path were established in this way. During this time, many of the people who had followed Luo Fan had unknowingly moved from one world to another. The cultivators who called Luo Fan teacher had also gathered in this world. However, they all knew the rules, so they would not disturb Luo Fan in a short period of time. Instead, they waited for him to communicate with other forces and finally waited for Luo Fan to decide what to do before they decided what to do. Of course, there was no need to say much about their thoughts when they came here at this time. Apart from seeking refuge with Luo Fan, apart from becoming a member of his force, there was nothing else they could do. 10 days later, after Luo Fan did not agree to cooperate with any force, those forces finally stopped coming to disturb him. At this time, the cultivators who followed Luo Fan came forward. The one at the front was naturally the cultivator who looked like a boy. The cultivator came forward and immediately congratulated Luo Fan. He congratulated Luo Fan for being able to obtain this world and make it the foundation of his force. Then, he expressed his desire to join Luo Fan's force. Looking at their extremely excited expressions, it seemed that they were even more delighted than Luo Fan that this world could activate that glimmer of hope and make this place the foundation of a force. Build a force. Luo Fan looked at them and said indifferently, "No, I don't want to build a force." His words were like an earth-shattering one. The tens of thousands of cultivators who came to seek refuge with him were dumbfounded and at a loss of what to do. After all, Everything that Luo Fan did before was to show that he wanted to build a force. If that was not the case, why didn't he transfer this world away, and why didn't he cooperate with other forces? If he didn't do these things, wasn't it because he wanted to build a force? Teacher, why don't you build a force? If you build a force, your influence will increase greatly. When that time comes, it will be more convenient for you to collect resources. The boy tried to persuade him anxiously. As a cultivator with a sense of responsibility and a sense of mission, he recognized Luo Fan as his teacher. Naturally, he had a lot of consideration for Luo Fan and wanted him to obtain more benefits. The other cultivators also kept trying to persuade Luo Fan to build a force. Some even said that all of them had relatives and friends behind them. They could also pull their relatives and friends to join this force. It would be enough to make this force grow from an unknown force to a giant in a short period of time. It would be enough to compete with the top-ranked individual cultivator forces. Some of the more ambitious ones even thought that they should be able to compete with the force established by the Dao Master. In response to their persuasion, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "I don't want to build such a force. No matter how many benefits there are, it is not enough to distort my will." His words instantly cut off all the cultivators' persuasion. After all, they respected Luo Fan as their teacher. To a certain extent, they could even be considered as Luo Fan's disciples. With this kind of identity, they could give some suggestions to Luo Fan in other areas, but when it came to cultivation, they could not interfere at all. At this moment, these cultivators could only hold back their words until their faces turned red. They wanted to speak, but they did not dare to. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled again and said, "Although I am not interested in building a force, you guys can. I will leave this world to you to build the force you want." There were actually not many weak cultivators among the tens of thousands of cultivators in front of him. Even compared to Luo Fan, they were many times weaker. However, there was no lack of powerful cultivators who could beat up the old man who was still trying to figure out how to enter the vortex. Such tens of thousands of cultivators were more than enough to establish a force, at least in terms of the upper echelons. With Luo Fan's current understanding of the various forces, not many forces could completely suppress them in this aspect. This was enough for this force to get through the most dangerous period at the beginning. It would give them a chance to improve the overall strength of the force and become a true force in the forest. Chapter 2014. The forces on the Dao Master's path could not be compared to the forces in the outside world. There were endless worlds on the Dao Master's path. Even if there was only one treasure in each of these worlds that was helpful to the cultivation of cultivators at their level, the number of such treasures added up would probably be endless. Under such circumstances, if there was a force that could help them, it was self-evident how much of an advantage they could gain in the fight for such treasures. Needless to say, the benefits to their cultivation went without saying. Not to mention that since ancient times, countless cultivators had risked their lives here, leaving behind countless relics and rare treasures. These were all things that required the help of forces to fight for. There were also all kinds of miscellaneous matters that required the help of forces to deal with under such circumstances. How could establishing a force on the Dao Master's path in the outside world be comparable to establishing a force on the Dao Master's path? They did not believe that Luo Fan did not know this. However, even so, Luo Fan was still very calm, as if he was sweeping away the fallen leaves at his feet. He directly threw the foundation of the force to them and let them play by themselves. How could they not be shocked and in disbelief? "Master, please reconsider," the cultivator hurriedly said. The other cultivators also bowed one by one, asking Luo Fan to reconsider. Luo Fan just said lightly, "Do you think I didn't think about it before I spoke?" Although his words were calm, they were like a clap of thunder. It shocked all the cultivators here, and they all looked a little embarrassed. Before, they just instinctively wanted Luo Fan to retract his order. They did not expect that these words would mean that Luo Fan did not think it through. After all, they were not ordinary living beings here. Instead, they were existences that had almost reached the peak of cultivation. Words that could be said among ordinary living beings could not be said here. Go. Do what you want to do with this world. As long as you don't disturb me, it's fine. Luo Fan said. Hearing this, the many creatures could only bow and thank Luo Fan. Then they all retreated. After retreating, they gradually felt an indescribable excitement in their hearts. After all, this was a world that had already activated a trace of life. Such a world allowed them to see their force prospering day by day and eventually occupy a place on the path of Dowmaster. From then on, they were no longer rootless duckweeds. How could they not be excited? Even at this moment, they were incomparably glad that Luo Fan had not agreed to it. No matter how noble an existence was, they would definitely have their own selfish motives. Although these living beings all had a transcendent sense of responsibility, they were not absolutely noble existences after all. Naturally, he had his own selfish motives. Previously, when he begged Luo Fan to establish his faction, it was out of gratitude. Now that Luo Fan had completely rejected him, there was naturally nothing more to say. Naturally, his desire to benefit himself took the initiative. Even though they were itinerant cultivators, they knew very well how to build a force. The whole process of establishing a force. Naturally, it was extremely smooth. Soon, in this part of the world, the place with the densest Dharma was occupied by them by virtue of their status as guests on the path of Dowmaster. In the process, the living beings that originally existed here were driven away by them, emptying out the area within a radius of hundreds of thousands of light years. There were strong and weak living beings, and there were countless types of them. However, no matter how strong or weak they were, in the face of tens of thousands of powerful cultivators who could control this part of the world at will, it was impossible for them to resist. Not every cultivator was like the old man. Fortunately, these cultivators knew that this part of the world was activated by Luo Fan. While Luo Fan was still here, they naturally could not go too far. They still held back a little, so no living beings died in the process. Of course, those who died due to the change of environment were not something they could change after that. The cultivators began to use their control over the Dharma of the world to build the headquarters of their force within the area of hundreds of thousands of light years. The headquarters of such a force would definitely need to integrate with the Dharma of the world. During this process, the Dharma of the entire world would constantly tremble and change. This not only brought great pressure to the cultivators who were born and raised in this world, but also brought them great opportunities. The greater the changes in the Dharma of the world, the more mysteries it revealed, and the easier it would be for them to comprehend it. Under such circumstances, the increase in their cultivation realm would naturally be greater. Among them, the old man not far away from Luo Fan also benefited greatly. Through this tremor, he used his powerful will and extraordinary cultivation wisdom to brazenly penetrate all the fog and find a way to step into the vortex. At that moment, his entire body emitted an indescribable light. This was a faint light, and under this light, it was like the clear light coming from the bottom of the sea. It had an indescribable penetrative power. Vaguely, even the laws seemed to be unable to withstand the penetration of the clear light. The clear light drilled into them and shone under the cover of the clear light. At the same time, the fog above the whirlpool, which was the mechanism that made the whirlpool seem illusory and real at the same time, seemed to have been completely expelled by the clear light. The whirlpool finally appeared in front of the old man without any reservations, allowing him to truly come into contact with the whirlpool. At that moment, the old man had completely forgotten about everything that had happened to this world. He completely threw the misfortune of this world being occupied by foreign cultivators to the back of his mind. All he could see was the dark vortex before him. He also saw the possibility of transcendence that lay behind the dark vortex. He did not hesitate at all. After the vortex was completely revealed, he took a step forward and brazenly crashed into the vortex, disappearing in front of Luo Fan, disappearing from this part of the world. As he disappeared, the clear light also disappeared. The vortex became indistinct again. It was faintly discernible, as if there was some kind of barrier between it and the vortex. It seems that I succeeded. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face when he saw this, and such a thought flashed through his mind. Based on his understanding of this world, he had already determined that the vortex was the entrance to the Tao Master's path and the only chance of survival in this world. However, no matter what, it was just a guess. Without a real example, it was impossible to be completely sure that it was the entrance. Only at this moment, when the old man really disappeared into the vortex, he could truly be sure of this. As for the fact that the old man did not say anything to him or this world before he left, he felt that it was quite normal. This was the foundation of any cultivator. In fact, it was all for oneself. No matter how noble and awe-inspiring a cultivator was, in the end, it was all for oneself. The reason why he was so noble and awe-inspiring was that it could bring him enough benefits on a certain level. In this kind of situation, in the face of a path that could bring them transcendence, but they did not know how long it could last and whether it would disappear in the next moment, no cultivator would waste any time. Even if it was just a bit of time to thank others, even if it was just a bit of time to look back at the world that gave birth to them and raised them. At this moment, cheers came from all over the world. Amidst the cheers, one figure after another rushed towards the vortex from all directions. Obviously, all the actions of the old man had been seen by the true higher-ups of this world, the many powerful cultivators who were similar to the old man. At the very least, they had sensed it. And just like Luo Fan, they were waiting for the final result of the old man's action. They wanted to see if the vortex could really transcend and if it really represented the way out of this world. At this moment, they finally relaxed completely when they saw the old man vanish. They couldn't wait any longer, and they started to rush over. They intended to leave this world that had imprisoned them for countless millions of years, or even a trillion years through the vortex as soon as possible. As for Luo Fan, although he was here, none of the cultivators noticed his existence. After all, he was an existence that could completely control the laws of this world. With the help of the laws of this world, it was extremely easy for such an existence to not be discovered by others. Although he had revealed himself earlier, it was only in front of the old man. In other words, only the old man could discover his existence and his actions. Apart from the old man, no other living being could see him at all. At the very least, they could see him directly. As for the old man's intuition, that was uncertain. Something like intuition was mysterious and unfathomable. Every living being had their own intuition. If any cultivator or living being was suddenly seized by a sudden impulse and discovered some sort of trace of Luo Fan's existence, they could only respect that person. Very soon, the tallest mountain in this world was surrounded by a dense crowd of several thousand living beings. Every single one of these living beings was a supreme existence or even above the Emperor's stage. At this moment, they were all staring covetously at the mountain, at the entrance that the old man had left behind. The old man was not alone. He had quite a number of disciples. In reality, there were hundreds of thousands of cultivators on the tallest mountain. At this moment, these hundreds of thousands of cultivators were all trembling. They felt an indescribable pressure envelop them, and they even had to be careful when they breathed. They were afraid of angering something and bringing disaster upon themselves. There were naturally many experts amongst these disciples, and it was even to the extent that some had attained the supreme monarch realm. However, when faced with thousands of powerful cultivators with strange hostility, they were still not enough. At this moment, even the strongest cultivators were trembling with fear. Most of them were trembling with fear, unable to maintain their composure. This mountain is the only way out for us cultivators. You have no virtue, but you cannot take it for yourself, an elderly cultivator with the demeanor of an immortal said calmly. These words reached the ears of all the cultivators on the mountain. Their eyes were filled with indescribable humiliation and hatred. They had lived here for who knew how many billions of years. No one had ever dared to speak to them like this. However, at this moment, their founding ancestor had only just left. Yet, Other people had come to force them to open the entrance, forcing them to leave the home that they had lived in for billions of years. How could they accept this? Impudent. This is the entrance opened by the founding ancestor. How dare you act so presumptuously? The supreme emperor stage cultivator roared. His body grew larger and larger until he was a giant. He stood tall on the mountain peak, facing off against the thousands of powerful cultivators around him. Looking at his furious appearance, it was as if he was going to destroy the world and take them down with him. Facing this situation, the thousands of cultivators around him all had calm expressions. Another cultivator said, "That was the past. This place is different from the past. Do you want to fight against all the cultivators in the world?" As he spoke, waves of powerful aura pressed down on the giant from all directions. Under the pressure of the terrifying aura, the giant's body trembled violently. The giant trembled slightly and began to crumble. It turned into countless specks of light that scattered in all directions. However, it was only a silhouette condensed from power. The expressions of the cultivators on the mountain became extremely ugly when they saw the calm and cold expressions of the thousands of cultivators around them. They finally knew that the situation was hopeless. No matter how unwilling they were, as long as they did not want to die, they could only accept reality. In fact, after accepting it, they would have to thank them for showing mercy. If they didn't directly attack and wipe out all the cultivators on the mountain, with this understanding, the supreme emperor stage cultivator snorted coldly. He casually waved his hand and directly covered the mountain. With a slight tremble, he cut off half of the mountain and put it away, turning this place from the tallest mountain in the world into the largest platform. At this moment, some cultivators frowned and were about to act to stop him. After all, it had already been said that this mountain had become the most important way out of this world. Now that it was taken away, it was simply a slap in the face. However, in the end, they still thought that they were being a bit unreasonable. In consideration of the prestige of the old man who had left for countless years, they held back and did not act to stop him. After the cultivator cut off half of the mountain, he could not be bothered to stay any longer. With a sway of his body, he turned into a ray of light and charged into the distance. In the blink of an eye, he had already brought everyone in the mountain gate and disappeared before the eyes of the many cultivators. He had gone to another location to rearrange the mountain gate. Indeed, the style of cultivation. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. He had seen the interaction between the many creatures here. Even when the cultivator took away half of the mountain, he was still on the mountain. However, with the help of the mysterious changes of the laws, the cultivator's power could not affect him at all, so he was not taken away. At this moment, his figure was only floating in the air, not far away from the vortex. With this thought, he did not stay here any longer. He got up and took a step forward. His figure was about to disappear into the void. When he reappeared, he was already in a very quiet place. After he left, among the thousands of creatures around the vortex, nearly a third of them let out sighs of relief and looked relieved. He finally left. Fortunately, we didn't go too far. Otherwise, if he couldn't stand it and attacked, we might. Some cultivators muttered. The cultivators that let out sighs of relief were none other than the cultivators that could sense Luo Fan's existence. Of course, not every single one of these cultivators was certain of Luo Fan's existence. Only a few of them were truly certain of this. However, due to their familiarity with each other and the mutual exchange of their senses, they were finally convinced that an extremely powerful and terrifying existence had been staying near the vortex all this time. They had no idea how powerful that existence was or what its purpose was. However, their instincts told them that if that existence willed it, none of them would be able to escape from a single finger. In fact, although they appeared rather calm earlier, almost all of them were secretly cursing themselves for not being able to keep their composure and not coming back here for a period of time. In fact, if it wasn't for their extraordinary willpower, they might have turned around and left due to their impulses. Now that they discovered that the terrifying existence had disappeared, it went without saying how relaxed they were. When these cultivators relaxed, they naturally gave off a different feeling to others. Among the cultivators that could cultivate to this stage, which one of them was not extremely intelligent. At this moment, they all thought of something, and their expressions became filled with lingering fear. Some of them even broke out in cold sweat. Chapter 2015. Luo Fan was no longer interested in the various changes happening in this part of the world. After leaving that place, he began to study the essence of life in the place he had chosen, searching for the fundamental principles that could detect the fluctuations of perfect and imperfect heaven and earth existences. This was not a simple process. Even though they had used all sorts of methods to probe and study the creature, it was still a complicated process that could make any cultivator despair if they wanted to find the principle behind the waves. However, for this, Luo Fan, who had already expected it, was not discouraged, nor did he feel any despair. He believed that there must be a way to bypass the complexity and get to the root. There was an extremely vast space inside the essence of life. It was filled with endless fog, and every bit of fog emitted subtle fluctuations. In the end, they continuously gathered and turned into an indescribably mysterious fluctuation that could even detect perfect heaven and earth existences. Of course, because the laws of the outside world had seeped into the essence of life under Luo Fan's control and formed a world here, the gathered fluctuations did not leak out of the essence of life. Instead, they were absorbed and transmitted into the seemingly real world formed by the countless laws of the world. Looking at the various things inside the essence of life, Luo Fan's heart moved. His perception had already completely integrated into the world formed by the countless laws and laws, fusing with any strand of laws and laws in the world. He began to sense the extremely mysterious probing fluctuations from the perspective of the world. As the fluctuations seeped into the world formed by the laws of the world, countless complex and indescribable subtle changes occurred. Every bit of change would be reflected back through the undulations and received by the countless individuals of the fog within the essence of life. In the end, these particles of fog would undergo all sorts of changes, and in the end, these changes would be reflected back on the undulations, causing the detection undulations to change again, and then produce a corresponding reaction with everything in the surroundings, and then feedback again, and so on and so forth. The cycle repeated. Endless, endless, and endless. This process felt as if the world and the essence of life were using the fluctuations as a bridge to communicate with each other. This kind of communication was simply incomprehensible to the normal Luo Fan. But at this moment, he had completely fused with this world and was borrowing the countless nomological laws to transmit information into his mind. The situation was completely different. In this state, his thoughts as a living being were gradually abandoned. As the will of the world, as a higher level of senses that surpassed living beings, it was gradually awakening. Perhaps it would not be so easy for other cultivators, nor would it be so fast. However, it was different for Luo Fan. After all, he had seen the will of the heavens and earth many times. He had even transformed into an existence similar to the will of the heavens and earth several times. As such, he was able to complete this transformation billions of times faster than other cultivators. In a trance, he could already faintly sense that the life essence was communicating with him. It was an indescribable truth, the key to the formation of heaven and earth. These principles, these tricks, these keys, they were complicated and indescribably profound. These principles contained a kind of eternal and indestructible charm. It was as if one only needed to fully grasp these principles. They would be able to achieve eternity and indestructible. This is the principle. An indescribable shock surged in Luo Fan's heart. He didn't expect that this living being would be so mysterious. He originally thought that this creature relied on a certain characteristic of the fluctuations to achieve such a profound effect, but he did not expect that. In the end, the fluctuations themselves were nothing. The truly profound thing was actually the life itself. That fluctuation was indeed just a bridge. If there was anything special about it, it was just a bridge. If there was anything profound about them, it would only be able to allow the creature to communicate with heaven and earth. The true reason why the fluctuations could reach such a level of detecting whether something was a perfect heaven and earth was because the essence of that creature contained the basic template of a perfect heaven and earth. It was unknown where this basic template came from, but it had completely fused with the origin of this life and integrated into its instincts. When this creature detected anything else, it would compare that object with this template. If it was fundamentally the same, then it would naturally be a perfect heaven and earth grade object. However, if it did not match, then it naturally would not reach the level of a perfect heaven and earth, of course. This process was also extremely complicated. It might even make a false saint lose the ability to think about anything else after completing this comparison and become a fool from then on. Perhaps this was also the fundamental reason why this kind of creature, with the basic template of a perfect heaven and earth, could not have intelligence. It could not even have the basic thinking ability of ordinary low-level animals. All its actions could only rely on its instincts. After all, even if that creature had enough intelligence and thinking ability, it was impossible for it to be higher than a false saint. Even a false saint could have all their thinking ability occupied after completing this process and become a fool. How could this creature surpass a false saint? After understanding the essence of this detection fluctuation, Luo Fan instantly understood what he had to do. His heart stirred slightly, and countless thoughts flowed through his mind. Countless thoughts flickered in his mind. Not long after, he understood how to use that fluctuation. Soon after, his perception gradually left the world formed by the laws within the essence of life. Then his eyes narrowed, and an indescribable fluctuation emitted from his body and began to seep into the mysterious life essence in front of him. This fluctuation was almost the same as the fluctuation emitted by the life essence. It was also obscure, mysterious, and unpredictable, and had the unique characteristics of the detection fluctuation. However, this was only on the surface. Compared to the fluctuation emitted by the life essence, the fluctuation emitted by Luo Fan was many times weaker in terms of information feedback. For the fluctuation emitted by the life essence, the information transmitted into the fluctuation could instantly receive feedback from the life essence. In every instant, there would be billions of trillions of transmissions and feedback happening within these fluctuations. The fluctuations emanating from Luo Fan's body were completely different. The fluctuation emitted by his body could indeed transmit the surrounding information into Luo Fan's body through the fluctuation and into his heart. However, it took a long time for him to receive feedback. Moreover, after the feedback was sent back, the fluctuation did not change smoothly. On the contrary, it seemed a little distorted. It was a little chaotic, as if this kind of feedback was not enough to cause the fluctuation to change smoothly. It's a pity that I don't have a template. If I had a template, I would also be able to achieve that speed. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. At this moment, the ripples emanating from his body had already connected with the essence of his life. As they were connected together, countless information from the life essence poured into Luo Fan's heart through these fluctuations. They began to accumulate and condense, gradually transforming into a completely different appearance, causing him to gradually feel a stronger and stronger pressure. I can't handle this kind of information. At this time, Luo Fan had already understood in his heart. As he understood this, he took out an item without hesitation. This item was in the shape of a mirror, and light and shadow flowed within it. It was a starry universe. This was none other than Luo Fan's half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. After this primordial origin spiritual treasure appeared, it naturally emitted a spiritual light. As it swallowed, it revealed a kind of eternal and indestructible temperament. Anyone who saw this mirror and the existence of this spiritual light would instantly understand that this was an unimaginable and mysterious treasure. Luo Fan's heart trembled. The spiritual light condensed and instantly rushed into his heart, connecting with his heart. As this spiritual light connected with his heart, the original mind that was originally in his heart continued to accumulate. The endless information that made him feel more and more uncomfortable was like a mountain torrent that had found an exit. It began to crazily rush out of his heart through this spiritual light and rushed into the mirror. In an instant, there seemed to be a little gray water droplet in the center of the mirror, appearing and becoming bigger and bigger. The gray marks became more and more obvious. When this information was completely transferred, Luo Fan's heart relaxed, and his thinking ability also returned to its original complete clarity. It was also at this moment that he reacted. This is the basic template of the perfect world, right? Understanding this, he could not help but have an indescribable look of anticipation and curiosity on his face. What was the basic template of the perfect world like? How accurate was it? What was the limit of its ability to reach? Could its accuracy be improved? These kinds of questions were all mysteries to him, and he could not help but pay attention to them. The current Luo Fan had only become a transit point, only providing the fluctuations of the communication connection. No matter how much information flowed through, it would not cause much pressure to him. Therefore, at this time, he had enough spare energy to observe and understand the information that flowed through, to extract the mysteries within, and to sense the mysteries within. The flow of information was vast and mighty. Of course, it contained the endless mysteries of the perfect world. However, it was not transmitted specifically for the understanding of living beings. The mysteries were transmitted for the understanding of the world. Therefore, under Luo Fan's perception of this information, although he clearly knew that there were countless profound truths in it, he could only grasp a few of them. At most, he could only obtain broken fragments that were difficult to comprehend. It was simply difficult for him to understand them and truly experience anything. However, even if that was the case, just this faintly discernible insight had already made Luo Fan feel that he had gained a lot. Faintly, even his own worldview was constantly squirming, as if it had received a push and was slowly evolving towards a higher level and a more perfect stage. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan gradually forgot everything in the outside world. Time also began to slowly pass. Unknowingly, 10,000 years had passed. On this day, the life essence in front of Luo Fan suddenly collapsed, and the information that flowed through Luo Fan's mind was completely cut off at this moment. With this change, Luo Fan suddenly woke up from the immersion, and his expression changed slightly as he looked at the half-step spirit treasure in his hand. At this moment, on the surface of the mirror, there was a world composed of endless gray that was constantly surging and changing. Between the surging and changing, endless light and shadows flashed by. It seemed to be a world, an ocean, and a starry sky. It also seemed to be endless living beings. The various categories were enough to exhaust the limits of the imagination of all living beings. It's complete. Looking at the mirror, Luo Fan had an epiphany in his heart. This was obviously the basic template of a perfect world. The charm of perfection that it emitted was the best proof of this. After obtaining such a template, the half-step spirit treasure had undergone some kind of change that Luo Fan couldn't understand. The spiritual light that it emitted contained a kind of eternal indestructibility, and it was more than 100 times stronger than before. Obviously, after obtaining this template, the half-step spirit treasure had definitely obtained great benefits. Perhaps it hadn't become a true primordial origin spiritual treasure, but it must have taken a big step towards that stage. Only in this way the half-step spirit treasure would become like this, and it was a little incomprehensible to him. With a slight thought, he turned to look at the life essence that had just collapsed. At this moment, the life essence had turned into countless tiny fragments. Each of these fragments was as small as a speck of dust, and they were swept by the breeze and constantly dissipated in all directions. It looked like the thing that was originally formed by the accumulation of countless specks of dust was gradually dispersing. After losing the template, it finally can't remain complete anymore. But this is also good. It might be your lucky chance. Luo Fan looked at this scene and already understood what was going on. The scene before him was clearly the result of the life essence transferring all of the template into the half-step spirit treasure through the fluctuation, and finally, it could no longer restrain itself through the template. In other words, it was suppressing itself. As a result, the countless fragments of the life essence could no longer unite as one, and they naturally collapsed. As for why this was said to be the life essence's lucky chance, the reason was very simple. Because even if it turned into countless fragments and scattered, the life essence still didn't disappear. After dispersing, the countless tiny life essence that it turned into could integrate into this world, and finally, through the reincarnation system of this world, constantly perfecting itself. In the end, one day, every fragment of the life essence could evolve into a complete life essence. Even if the life essence at that time was far inferior to the previous life essence, it would still be reborn after breaking free from its original shackles. The intelligence and thinking that were originally suppressed by the foundation template of the perfect world would also be able to return. Whether this was a good thing or a bad thing was a matter of opinion. Therefore, it could naturally be considered as a fortuitous encounter for him. With a slight thought, Luo Fan casually waved his hand, and a gust of wind swept up. The countless fragments brazenly scattered everywhere, and in the blink of an eye, they had completely disappeared in front of him, as if they were never there. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had an indescribable feeling. Why is it so much faster? After figuring out the feeling, his expression could not help but change slightly. Because the feeling clearly told him that in less than 3,000 years, he would welcome his fourth great tribulation. 3,000 years might be extremely long in the eyes of ordinary people, and even hundreds of generations of inheritance. However, to an existence like Luo Fan, it was not much different than the blink of an eye. Originally, he still had tens of millions of years to prepare, but suddenly it had become almost 3,000 years in the blink of an eye. Even Luo Fan could not help but be shocked. More importantly, he did not understand why he would suddenly speed up the arrival of the Great Tribulation by so much. All along, he had relied on the improvement of his cultivation realm to bring the Great Tribulation forward. If his cultivation realm improved by a small margin, the Great Tribulation would be brought forward for a short time. If his cultivation realm improved by a large margin, the Great Tribulation would be brought forward for a longer time. But now he clearly did not feel that his cultivation realm had improved by much. But why did the Great Tribulation suddenly come forward so much? After all, Luo Fan was Luo Fan. The shock in his heart did not stay in his heart for too long. Very soon, he had already calmed down, and his thoughts also regained clarity. No matter what the reason is, I obviously can't let the time be pushed back. What I need to do now is to deal with this advance. With this thought, he lowered his head to look at the mirror in his hand, which was the half-step mixed origin spiritual treasure. This treasure was still quietly lying there, and in his hand, the feeling was still the same, without any change. However, he had an intuition that perhaps the root cause of his great tribulation being brought forward was because of it, and the hope of passing through the fourth great tribulation was probably also on it. Chapter 2017. Boom! In a situation where all other means were useless, the fist slammed into Luo Fan's body. In an instant, an incomparably pure and absolute power erupted from the fist, violently detonating his entire body. He discovered that his mind, his senses, his will, his power of laws, and everything else had completely exploded at this moment. In the midst of this explosion, he suddenly became dazed. It was as if everything about him was disintegrating and transforming into an incomparably mysterious and profound existence. A clear and turbid feeling filled all of his senses and even replaced all of his senses. In a daze, he had completely lost his consciousness. Whether it was his perception of time, space, or even everything in the world, he had completely lost his senses. That was what Luo Fan felt. but to the outside world, it looked like he had been directly hit in the head by the fist. The instant his head was hit, his body began to gradually disintegrate, turning into two streams of air. One was clear air, and the other was turbid air. After the two streams of air separated, they began to condense and form the concept of up and down, as well as the concept of directions that were derived from the concept of up and down. After that, as his body completely disintegrated, he had completely transformed into a world that was completely different from the world created by the baleful aura. However, its structure was almost the same. Although this world was only in its embryonic form, the laws and the four basic existences were still in a state of disorder. There was only chaos in this world. Apart from that, there was nothing else. However, it was a world after all. Moreover, it was a world that was constantly evolving and becoming more and more complete. The appearance of such a world, however, it formed a strong conflict with the world created by the baleful aura. The two worlds were like two extremes, incompatible with each other like fire and water. Countless terrifying conflicts constantly erupted between them. Although this conflict was a challenge for the two worlds, it was also a great opportunity. Originally, the two worlds might have needed countless years to evolve to a truly stable level. However, as the conflict continued, the two worlds constantly accelerated their evolution, constantly changing the direction of their evolution according to the direction of the other's impact. In the end, the originally long evolution process was shortened by thousands or even tens of millions of times. In just a few short years, the two worlds already had an almost complete outline. The world created by the baleful aura was a world with a round sky and a square earth. The sky was like a dome, the earth was like a chessboard, the mountains and rivers were like the latitude and longitude lines on the chessboard, and the sun, moon, and stars were like the chess pieces on the chessboard. As for the world created by Luo Fan's body, it was an incomparably boundless starry sky. The stars in the starry sky of the universe were dotted with stars. Every type of star. They were all like the condensation of a kind of law. They were all like the condensation of a kind of law. They cycled in the universe. They cycled in the universe, just like the circulation of laws. The two worlds were embedded in one place, constantly colliding and crushing each other. In the end, as they collided and crushed each other, they constantly destroyed each other and grew through the destruction of each other. In this way, an absolute balance was formed. After the appearance of the two worlds, this incomparably wondrous place was completely replaced by the two worlds. The endless baleful aura that originally existed here had completely disappeared. The void behind the baleful aura was also completely eliminated by the two worlds. In the two worlds, as time passed, life was gradually born. After the birth of this life, as the cycle of heaven and earth continued, it gradually strengthened and evolved further. In the end, the first wave of life was born in the two worlds. This wave of life was born and grew like frogs at the bottom of a well. In the end, it didn't even have the ability to discover the other world. It had already flourished and declined, completely dying out. All the life returned to the world, concentrating on the next wave of life's evolution. After an unknown period of time, the life evolved into life again, giving birth to the second wave of life in the two worlds. These life evolved again and grew again. In the end, before they could discover the other world, they had already flourished and declined again. They completely died and turned into life, returning to the world. In this way, wave after wave of life was born, grew, and died in the two worlds. The cycle of life and death was a refinement of the life in the world, causing the potential of this life to become deeper and deeper. This caused the next wave of life to have even greater potential, and the development of a life civilization became more prosperous. In the end, they were closer and closer to discovering the other world. In the end, after 129,600 waves of living beings continuously evolved, the living beings that evolved from the two worlds finally discovered the existence of the other world for the first time. And it was also from this wave of life that the two worlds began to engage in an even more tragic conflict. Living beings were originally a part of the world. When the living beings of the two worlds were in conflict and fought, it naturally represented that there was an additional path for the two worlds to clash. Thus, the conflict would naturally become even more intense. As for the more desperate conflict, for these two worlds, each had its own advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage was naturally that in this battle, the destruction of the two worlds would be stronger than before. Every clash would cause more damage to both worlds. And the advantage was that the two worlds would be better tempered and promoted during this process. In the end, the two worlds would grow faster and faster during this process. Originally, in the process of these two worlds evolving from nothing to the great thousand worlds, the cycle of living beings in these two worlds had developed to a total of 129,600 cycles. But after that, it only reached less than 1,000 waves of life. These two worlds had already grown to the level of a perfect world, and this, according to normal circumstances, would require at least 100 times more time than the original development from nothing to the great thousand world. This increase in speed, it had reached an unknown number of times. As the conflict between the life of the two worlds developed more and more, the first wave of life and the second wave of life gradually form a connection. This connection, it was using the other world as a transit point. In the end, the civilization essence of the first wave of life was conditionally transmitted to the second wave of life. In the end, it greatly accelerated the growth of the second wave of life, and also gave the second wave of life enough time and potential to reach a higher level. In this way, the degree of improvement of the life was constantly increasing. The reason behind this was not complicated, although the development of the two worlds was extremely similar. After all, it was impossible for them to be completely synchronized. Sometimes, one world had already entered the next wave of life cycle, while the other world was still in the previous wave of life cycle. In this case, this world could naturally obtain all kinds of information from the previous wave of life cycle from the other world, and then through this information, inherit the inheritance of the previous wave of life cycle. Even if this was not what the life of the other world wanted, it could not change this fact. This was because sometimes one world was faster. Sometimes one world was faster. In this way, the life of the two worlds had the opportunity to obtain the inheritance of the previous wave of life cycle. Then, the improvement of this wave of life cycle became faster and faster. Under such circumstances, when the living beings in the two worlds developed to a certain extent and accumulated enough legacies, they finally discovered the essence of this cycle of living beings. When they realized this, the living beings in the two worlds finally experienced a qualitative change. These two seemingly never-ending cycles of life were directly interrupted. The life of the two worlds gradually broke free from that kind of life cycle, and finally became the eternal protagonists of these two worlds, in a world that Luo-Fan had evolved. The life that had evolved generally looked like him. In other words, it was the appearance of the connate Taoist body that was suitable for the Tao Master Great World, the Earth universe, the untainted world, or the perfect world. The reason for this was very simple. This was the result of the influence of the traces of imprints that Luo-Fan had left in this world. In the other world, the appearance of the life of the other world was completely uncertain. In that other world, the appearance of the life of the other world was almost the same as the previous wave, and even different from any wave before. It could be the shape of a human, or it could be the shape of some strange insect, fish, bird, or beast. There was even a wave of life that was completely in the shape of a worm. In fact, it was this complete difference in form that made the conflict between the two worlds difficult to resolve. Even their forms were completely different. How could their minds understand each other? And since their minds could not understand each other, it was naturally impossible to resolve the conflict. In addition, the conflict between the two worlds had never stopped, which naturally led to the current result. When the life evolved from the evil aura finally broke the life cycle, Their form happened to be almost humanoid. However, it was only somewhat similar. The life of the world that Luo Fan had evolved did not treat the eight-legged, three-armed, and ten-eyed life as the same kind of life form as them. At this stage, the level of the two worlds had already been raised to the level of a perfect eight-tribulation world. Such a perfect world was only one last great world tribulation away from a great world. It could be said that it was already only one step away. There was no need to mention how powerful such a world was. As for the living beings in these two worlds, they had also grown to an unbelievable level during this process. So much so that there were already many saints in these two worlds, controlling the intense conflict between the two worlds. The reason why they were called saints was because some of the cultivators born in these two worlds were so powerful that they could transcend the shackles of these two worlds. They opened up a dojo outside these two worlds and looked down on these two worlds with a transcendent attitude. Such a method. It was already not much different from the legendary true saints. That was why they were called saints. However, yet such a saint was restricted by this strange void. Although he had already transcended these two worlds, he was unable to transcend this void, and he was even more unable to transcend this tribulation. He was still restricted by this tribulation in the region where these two worlds were located. This was clearly not the performance of a true saint, which was why it was said to be specious, but actually wrong. In terms of the level of saints, the two worlds were not much different from each other. In comparison, there were a few more saints in the world evolved from the baleful aura. Among them, there were as many as 13 saints in the world evolved from the baleful aura, while there were only 8 saints in the world evolved from Luo Fan's body. The gap between them wasn't small at all. However, even though there was such a big gap, even at the level of saints in these two worlds, no one could suppress the other. They were actually in a state of balance. Of course, this was not because the saints born in the world evolved from Luo Fan were much stronger than the saints born in the other world. The reason why they were able to maintain balance in such a disadvantageous situation was because the saints born from the world evolved from the baleful aura were not united at all. The saints born in these two worlds were not all born from this wave of life cycle, but formed from the continuous accumulation of the previous wave of life cycle. In other words, no matter which world it was among the saints, there was more than one who was achieved by the living beings in the previous cycle of living beings. Under such circumstances, the living beings on Luo Fan's side all had the same appearance as Luo Fan's born Taoist aptitude. Therefore, they were born with a sense of identity. They innately believed that they were of the same race, and that the other saints were either their juniors or their seniors. Either he was their senior. With such a sense of recognition, they naturally appeared to be extremely united. However, on the other side of the world, it was different. The form of each wave of life cycle evolved from these worlds was fundamentally different. This difference made even the living beings of the same world. The living beings left behind from the previous wave of life cycle treated the living beings born from the later wave of life cycle as different races. Under such circumstances, the saints who had become saints from different cycles of life naturally could not treat the saints of other cycles of life as the same race, since they were not of the same race. In their opinion, what was the essential difference between them and the living beings in the world that Luo Fan had evolved from? Under such circumstances, even if they could see the overall situation and could barely gather together to fight against the saints on Luo Fan's side, they would not do their best. In the end, it was only natural that the two sides maintained a balance. After these saints were born, the conflict between the two worlds began to gradually slow down. After all, such saints could be said to be the strongest existence in the two worlds and could even be said to be absolutely invincible. Under such circumstances, the focus of the conflict between the two worlds naturally shifted to them. These saints were not completely irrational and naturally could not be completely controlled by their instincts. In this kind of conflict, no matter when they would inevitably leave some way out to prevent their own nature from being damaged. It was easy to imagine how intense the conflict would be. As the conflict between the two worlds slowed down, the growth of the two worlds naturally slowed down. Originally, according to the original speed, perhaps it would only take a few tens of millions of years for the two worlds to develop beyond the level of a perfect world and become a great world. Now, it would probably take an unknown number of trillions of years to achieve this. There was not a single saint in the two worlds who was unaware of this. However, even if they were aware of this, they did not have any thoughts of intensifying the conflict. After all, to these saints, they did not know that they were living beings born from Luo Fan's fourth Great Tribulation. To them, in their understanding, the twin universes were already their everything. And here, apart from each other, there was no other danger. In this way, as long as they dealt with the other party, they would be able to have endless eternity. In this case, what was the difference between a few tens of millions of years and 100 trillion years? How could they possibly put themselves in greater danger for something that seemed to them to make little difference? Of course, it was inevitable that they would maintain the intensity of the conflict so that the two worlds would slowly evolve toward a higher level in an orderly manner. Time continued to pass under the tacit understanding between the two saints. Unknowingly, in the perception of the living beings in the two worlds, tens of trillions of years had already passed. In these tens of trillions of years, the nature of the two worlds did not undergo much improvement, but the cultivation civilization had already developed to an unimaginable height. Chapter 2018. In the billions of years between the two worlds, a pattern of cultivation tribulations had been formed. Under the arrangement of the sages, the conflict between the two worlds had turned into a scene of joy, one after another cultivation tribulation after another. In other words, the conflict between the two worlds had almost come to a standstill after the efforts of many sages over the years. Instead, there would be a cultivation tribulations between the two worlds every few years, such as a few hundred years or a few thousand years. Under the schemes and arrangements of the saints, the cultivators of the two worlds used some sort of excuse, or in other words, fought for something, transformed into something, and formed a pattern of battle. They schemed against each other, fought against each other, and finally, through this kind of fighting, this kind of hostility, the power of the conflict between the two worlds was released for the sages. This situation meant that their control over the two worlds had increased to a certain level. For the living beings inside the two worlds, it meant that they had obtained a relatively stable pattern, which allowed them to grow more and obtain more opportunities. However, this was only for the living beings inside the two worlds. For the two worlds, this result was like setting up a huge barrier in front of them while they were on the fast track to growth, causing the development of the two worlds to suddenly come to a standstill. As a result, the sages of the two worlds would naturally be faintly repelled by the two worlds. Normally, this kind of repulsion would not affect the saints of these two sides. They were still without tribulations, immeasurable, eternal, and indestructible. They controlled all the changes in the world and arranged the fate of all living beings in the world. Opportunities, playing chess with other sages, discussing the Tao. They lived leisurely and contentedly. However, when time developed to a certain stage, when the repelling reached a certain level, it would eventually erupt. When that time came, the immeasurable cataclysm would appear. This immeasurable cataclysm was a tribulation that even sages could not transcend. During this immeasurable cataclysm, even sages would have to participate in the battle between the two worlds. They would have to fight for that slim chance of survival. This was the plan of the two worlds, or rather, it was the instinctive thought of the two worlds. However, those saints were worthy of being called saints. They could even turn the increasingly intense conflict between the two worlds into cultivation tribulations. How could they possibly endure such a boundless cultivation tribulation? Therefore, after a few moments, the sages had already thought of a way to escape. That was to accept a disciple. Preaching meant spreading one's destiny and identity to the masses. They accepted many cultivators as their avatars and let those cultivators transcend the tribulation in their place. They used their identities to fight against other sages. In this way, they would be able to extricate themselves from the immeasurable tribulations. They would be able to look down on the battle between the two worlds with an absolutely transcendent attitude, and they would be able to use the same method to deal with the repulsion between the two worlds. Because of this, the space between the two worlds became even more calm. The entire situation became even more chaotic. Gradually, it settled down. The living beings in these two worlds became even more lifeless during this process. Once a cultivator was born, they were destined to have a place in the sage's plan. Their growth, every opportunity they had, every gain they had, every love and hate they had, were all part of the sage's plan. Under such circumstances, how could the two worlds come to life? Therefore, the cultivation civilization of the two worlds that should have continued to develop and sublimate also completely stabilized after reaching a certain level. The number of false sages, the number of despair, and the number of supreme emperors were all fixed at a certain level. A level that was countless times more than what it was at the beginning, but far less than what it should have been. During this process, the time between the two worlds gradually passed. Trillions of years. Unknowingly, billions of trillions of years had passed. During these billions of years, the situation between the two worlds seemed to be completely the same as before. It was still the same as before. The only difference was that there were many more traces of battle left in the void beyond that heaven and earth. These battle traces were none other than the traces left behind by the living beings who had obtained supreme power through various opportunities over the countless years and challenged the sages. After all, time had already passed so long. Even if only one living being could awaken a little bit of free will in billions of years, even if only one out of billions of living beings could obtain the ability to challenge the sages, the number of living beings that could challenge the sages must have reached an unimaginable level after countless billions of years. In this way, every living being that could challenge a saint would only leave behind a small trace here. Over countless years, the traces here would definitely increase greatly. In the end, the emptiness would become like this, causing this place to look rather chaotic. This time, the immeasurable tribulation is about to begin again, a sage muttered in the void. As he muttered, the other 20 sages reacted at the same time. Having gone through countless immeasurable tribulations, these sages were already extremely familiar with the process. It could even be said to be instinctive. Under such circumstances, under normal circumstances, an immeasurable tribulation was not enough to make them react. In fact, in the recent few times, whenever an immeasurable tribulation appeared, they did not show any special reaction. They merely treated it as a daily occurrence and did not even communicate with each other. They simply passed through the immeasurable tribulation in a tacit manner. Fellow Taoist, why are you so concerned about this immeasurable tribulation? A sage asked. Both of them. They were the sages of this world that Luo Fan had evolved into. They were also the two most ancient sages in this world. Back then, when they were still in the cycle of life, they had already established a rather good friendship. Throughout the billions of immeasurable tribulations, they were all on the same side. Given their status, they were in the myths and legends. It should also be the relationship between the three pure ones. I think something is wrong with this immeasurable tribulation. The sage who spoke first said. He had the appearance of an old man. His hair and beard were all white, but his face was rosy and did not have a single wrinkle. He looked like a slightly older baby. Something is wrong? Fellow Taoist, what do you feel? Another sage interrupted. The saint who interrupted was a saint with the appearance of a child, and his expression was calm. Compared to the sage who spoke first, he looked like a grandfather and grandson. However, the sage who spoke first seemed to care a lot about the sage who looked like a child. At the very least, he was rather respectful. Hearing what the sage said, his expression changed slightly, and he said, Fellow Taoist, you might not know this, but I had a sudden impulse just now. I suddenly feel that this might be our last immeasurable tribulation. Sudden inspiration, the last immeasurable cataclysm. The boy listened. The sage frowned slightly. They were all sages. They were all omnipotent beings in their respective worlds. Even in the void, They were powerful beings who could create their own dojos and create their own heaven and earth. They were able to comprehend all the changes in their hearts. Any ripple in their hearts was closely related to the world, and they had an inseparable connection with the mysterious changes in the unseen world. Under such circumstances, any change in the heart was actually a sign of some kind of change. Because of that, even if it was a change in the heart of an ordinary sage, he would not be able to ignore it. Moreover, it was a sign in the heart of a sage who specialized in divination. It seems like this immeasurable tribulation is really different. Let's work together to make a divination so that we can confirm what we are going to do, the sage said. The other 7 sages responded in unison and praised this as a great kindness. Following the greeting, the sages stepped out of their own dojos and arrived at the old man's dojo. Although being in their own dojos did not affect their divination, it still represented their attitude and the importance they placed on matter. Under such circumstances, how could they ignore the divination? The 8 sages gathered in this Taoist right temple, which instantly illuminated the old man's Taoist right temple, making it look like a fairyland. There were heavenly flowers and golden lotuses everywhere, and there were all kinds of mysterious phenomena everywhere. The disciples in the Taoist right temple all felt that they had an indescribable opportunity, and their cultivation began to soar uncontrollably. However, none of the 8 sages cared about that. After they arrived at the dojo, they sat on the seats that the old man prepared for them. They closed their eyes and dispersed the auspicious clouds. They began to communicate with each other and kept transmitting all kinds of information to each other. They shared their own cultivation paths, and with the help of such cultivation paths, they transmitted their divination abilities to each other. Then, their divination abilities complemented each other and boosted each other up to a higher level. Then, they began to divine what the old man's sudden inspiration had sensed. To these sages, time was meaningless. Although the old man's sudden inspiration had targeted the infinite cataclysm, in reality, it had been billions of years since they sensed that the infinite cataclysm was about to descend. There were still many cataclysms to go through in such a long time. This also meant that they had enough time to divine all of that. While they were making their divination, in the other camp, among the 13 sages on the other side of the chaotic world, one of them sensed something and roughly knew that the infinite cataclysm this time would be different. However, as mentioned before, the sages on the other side of the chaotic world were not united. Even if they sensed something, they could only divine it on their own. They even hid the secret and set up a heavenly secret defense in an attempt to stop others from sensing the heavenly secret. Under such circumstances, the 13 sages did not have much of a reaction. They continued to prepare for the infinite cataclysm as usual. Time gradually passed in such a situation. Unknowingly, before they knew it, 300 million years had passed. On this day, in the old sage's dojo, suddenly, a cry of surprise was heard. Following this exclamation, the auspicious clouds of the 8 sages began to surge. The originally colorful and gorgeous auspicious clouds, which illuminated the dojo like a fairyland, turned pitch black at this moment. Because of these changes, the entire dojo seemed to have turned into an azura hell. Evil winds blew everywhere, and misfortune filled the air. All the living beings there spat out everything they had gained over the past hundreds of millions of years in an instant. Some of them could not withstand the loss, and their bodies collapsed, their souls perished, and their souls dispersed. How is this possible? We've accumulated so much karma. The boy cried out in surprise. The other sages' expressions changed drastically. They no longer had the calmness and control they had before. All they felt was panic and shock. It was an incomprehensible emotion. The change in the auspicious clouds was not a result of the change in their minds. Instead, it was a result of them pushing aside the fog. It was a change that appeared after they saw through the truth and the essence. In other words, the pitch-black auspicious clouds in front of them were what their auspicious cloud should look like. The colorful appearance from before was just a facade. This kind of karma is the karma of the heavens and the earth, and it's not the karma of living beings at all. Only karma of such a level can taint us. Otherwise, with our saint's body, we won't die. How could he encounter such misfortune? The old man said with an ugly expression. The current him. He was only thinking about himself and the deaths of many living beings in his dojo. As for the loss of his own disciples, he did not care at all. These disciples were merely a substitute for him to pass through the immeasurable tribulation. How could he have any feelings for them? Under such circumstances, knowing that the immeasurable cataclysm this time was different from the past, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to use this alternative method. What meaning would these disciples have to him? So what if more of them died? The boy quickly regained his composure and said, "This amount of karma is already enough to break our position as saints. Now, if we want to avoid the fate of falling, the only way is to destroy the other world." That's right. No matter what the source of the karma is, it ultimately points to the other world. As long as we can completely shatter the other world and obtain the final victory, we will definitely be able to obtain an endless amount of merit. When that time comes, we don't need the merit to greatly improve ourselves. As long as it can neutralize the karma, we will obtain endless benefits, another saint said. These saints were all existences that had cultivated for countless trillions of years and had mastered countless trillions of immeasurable cataclysm. It went without saying that their intelligence was high, and their reaction speed had also reached a level that was unimaginable for any living being. They had lived countless years for ordinary living beings in an instant, so it was only natural that they could come up with a solution so quickly. At this moment, another saint said, "We might have an ally." Hearing this, the other saints all had faint smiles on their faces. They couldn't be more clear about the situation in the other world. There would definitely be saints in the other world who would sense what they sensed. However, with the situation in the other world, they definitely wouldn't be able to work together to calculate that kind of feeling. Because of this, they definitely wouldn't be able to find out that the immeasurable cataclysm was different before them. This disparity in information gave them enough room to maneuver. When that time came, they could distort their senses through the heavenly secrets, block their calculations, and then use various situations to rope in a few allies and take them down one by one. That would be a matter of time. These saints had been together for an unknown number of trillions of years and were already close to telepathic. At this moment, none of them had spoken clearly, but all of them understood each other's intentions. In fact, with just a slight thought, they had already divided the various tasks so that they were clear about what they should do, what the others should do, and what methods they should use to work together and complement each other. At this moment, they only exchanged glances and had already decided on the specific execution plan. Immediately, they all closed their eyes and began to perform their techniques. As they performed their techniques, all sorts of mysterious powers were released from their bodies. They gradually tainted and changed the surroundings, causing the originally pitch-black auspicious clouds above their heads to gradually change. The pitch-black color gradually faded, and the original colors started to appear again. Not long after, their respective auspicious clouds had completely returned to their original appearance. They were still so sacred, so mysterious, and so desirable. Chapter 2019. In just a few breaths of time, it was as if nothing had happened in the dojo. It was so much so that even the disciples of the saints who had died in the dojo had come back to life. They had completely lost their memories and had no idea that they had died once. They were only shocked by the mysteries of the dojo. To those who had yet to become true sages, although they could create countless living beings, it was obviously impossible for them to resurrect a powerful being who had already surpassed false sages like kneading clay figurines. However, it was obvious that the people here were not below the true sage level. Although they seemed to be sages in this great calamity, they were actually real sages. The power that they possessed was naturally the power that only sages possessed. How difficult would it be for sages to resurrect those who were not sages? Goodbye. The sages bid farewell to the old man one by one and turned to leave. Not long after, the old man was the only sage left. Following that, the old man did not hesitate. He immediately left the room and headed toward the dojo of a saint from the other camp. They had known each other for billions of trillions of years. Even if they were enemies, they had already become friends. It was normal for them to visit each other occasionally to discuss the Tao. It was not unexpected for the old man to visit them at this time. The sage did not notice that the immeasurable tribulation this time would be a little special. He was only happy to see the old man and immediately welcomed him in. A few days later, the old man leisurely left and returned to his dojo. However, the dojo of the sage had already undergone a strange change. There seemed to be some doubt, and some inexplicable anger in it. Soon after, there was an inexplicable barrier between this dojo and the other dojos of the same camp. There was also a power that concealed the heavenly secrets being released from the dojo, concealing the heavenly secrets that were originally quite clear. As a result, the other sages had to expend many times more power to deduce the heavenly secrets than they did in the past. His behavior naturally surprised the other sages of the same camp. Not long after, a few sages set off from their respective dojos and came to the dojo of the sage to seek an audience with this sage. However, they were given the cold shoulder. The dojo was like a stubborn rock. He did not respond to their request for an audience at all, completely treating them as air. This situation made the faces of the few sages turn rather ugly. Although the 13 sages were in the same camp, there were still some barriers between them due to the differences between their races. Although the estrangement between them had mostly disappeared after spending billions of trillions of years together, it still existed. At this time, when the saint did not give him any face, the estrangement began to grow rapidly. Although this kind of growth was not enough to make them fall out immediately, if someone remediated in the future, it could eventually be eliminated. However, it was still an increase after all. After all, it had already affected their cooperation quite a bit. At that moment, the sages snorted. They turned around and left, returning to their respective dojos. As they left, the sages on the side of the world that Luo Fan had transformed began to take action. They each visited the saints of the other camp that they knew. No one knew what they said to the sages, but after they left, the sages all began to be wary of the other sages. Of course, they were not just wary of the sages of the same camp, but of all the other sages. It was as if they had suddenly treated everyone else as their own opponents, as if they were competitors who were fighting for something important with them. The sage among the 13 sages who could sense that there would be some changes in the immeasurable tribulations could sense this change. He had a bad premonition in his heart. Oh no, the heavenly secrets have become chaotic. The difficulty of divination has increased by at least 10,000 times. On this day, the sage stopped his divination, a look of helplessness in his eyes. Although he had been deducing for so many years, he had only deduced by himself and had not deduced with the other saints at the same time. Therefore, although he had made some progress, it was relatively little. At the very least, at this time, he had yet to remove the dazzling appearance that he was currently displaying, and had yet to see the karma of the universe that had almost blotted out the sun and sky. Because of this, although he felt that the abnormal behavior of the heavenly secrets had something to do with the other side of the world, or even that the other side was doing something to affect the divination of their side of the world, he did not think too much about it. In his heart, he only felt that the other camp was plotting something against them. With this thought in mind, he did not panic. In his helplessness, instead, he seemed to be overflowing with interest. This was not because he had an unusual preference, but because the countless billions of years of fighting and scheming against the other camp in the void had long made the sages feel extremely dry and bored. Any change, even if it was a plot against them, would only bring some new excitement and fun to their boredom. In any case, no matter what, as sages they would not be harmed at all. In this way, it was not difficult to understand why the sage before him would have such an attitude after knowing that the other camp might be plotting against him. In fact, he was not the only one who had such an attitude. The other sages more or less had the same attitude. Could it be that none of the 13 sages on this side could not see that the various changes were a plot by the 8 sages on the other side? Could it be that they were so stubborn that they were completely provoked by the sages? This was because they were happy to see it happen, which was why things had developed to this stage. After all, to them, these plots and schemes were equivalent to two people playing chess, and one side using throwing knives that they had never seen before. The reason why the 8 sages used such a method was obviously because they knew that the sages would have such a mentality and thoughts. Time continued to pass. Catastrophes occurred between the two worlds, one after another. Under the control of the 8 sages on Luo Fan's side, the scale of the catastrophes kept increasing. In the beginning, the catastrophes were still normal. The two worlds each found a reason to start a war with the other world. In the end, after killing a certain number of cultivators, they retreated and completed the catastrophes. However, in the end, more than half of the world's energy would be gathered during each cataclysm, and the resulting battle would affect both worlds as a whole, causing great damage to both worlds after each cataclysm. Not only did the number of living beings die far exceeded the previous catastrophes, but the damage done to the world was also almost on the same level as the previous catastrophes. The cataclysm after cataclysm continued to accumulate. When the cataclysm was about to arrive, the two worlds were already riddled with holes. They could only be pieced together by the power of the sages, barely forming a complete entity. This situation was completely within the plan of the sages on Luo Fan's side. As for the 13 sages on the other side, they were all confused. They did not know why the other side sages would push the catastrophes to this stage. However, although they were confused, most of them were overflowing with interest. They hoped that the catastrophes would arrive soon, so that they could see clearly what the other side sages were trying to do and understand what they were trying to achieve after spending so many billions of years planning. The fun this time will definitely be enough for us to savor for billions of years. One day, among the 13 sages, one of them sighed. The other sages either responded with indifference or nodded in agreement. Although some of them looked angry, their eyes were also filled with interest. I'm more interested in knowing how we're going to return the favor next time. Another sage said. The eyes of the other sages lit up. It was like playing chess. When the opponent used the throwing knife technique to make you suffer a loss, you would naturally have to find a way to return the favor in order to enjoy the fun. If it was just eating the throwing knife and not being able to return the favor, then even if there was some fun, it would still be a great reduction. The sages were still rather optimistic at this time. They had never thought that this infinite cataclysm might be their last infinite cataclysm. In their minds, compared to the previous catastrophes, this catastrophe was only different because the other side sages had more intentions. However, as time approached the catastrophes, an indescribable pressure gradually accumulated in the hearts of the sages. After all, they were all sages, and their senses were not something that ordinary cultivators or living beings could compare to. Even if the heavenly secrets were concealed, they would still be able to sense something before the catastrophes were about to happen. Among them, the one who felt the most pressure was the sage who had long sensed that there was something strange about the catastrophes this time, and had been making deductions about it. On this day, the sage closed his eyes to regulate his breathing, but he could not enter a meditative state no matter what. His heartbeat was fast and slow, and the circulation of his mind seemed to have stagnated. He could not calm down for a while. What's going on? Why do I feel so uneasy now? Is something that endangers my safety happening? The sage opened his eyes, and a look of uncertainty appeared on his face. This kind of uneasiness was not much different from sudden impulse. It was a kind of omen, a kind of mysterious warning from the unseen world. Could it be that what I sensed back then wasn't because of the fellow cultivators from the other side? His heart suddenly skipped a beat. Although it had been trillions of years since he sensed it back then, he could still remember it clearly without missing anything. Even at this moment, that indescribable pressure was still vivid in his mind. The moment he recalled the feeling back then, a pressure that was countless times stronger than before suddenly descended on his heart. Under this pressure, his body could not help but tremble. An indescribably profound ripple emerged from his body and swept through his dojo. It directly wiped out all living beings, all space-time, and all laws within his dojo, causing it to descend into absolute chaos in the blink of an eye. As for the disciples of the sages, they did not even let out a cry throughout the entire process. At this point, the sage no longer cared about what the disciples of the sages were thinking. At this moment, he had completely understood in his heart that this kind of oppression right now, the pressure was targeting the same target as what he sensed back then. It seems like we've all been tricked by the fellow cultivators from the other side. He smiled bitterly. He sighed. Without any hesitation, he waved his hand, and everything in the dojo instantly returned to normal. Even the disciples of the sages who did not let out a cry were no different. Afterward, he directly sent out an invitation to the other 12 sages. He wanted them to come over and explain what he sensed. They also wanted to discuss how to deal with the changes this time. Even though the estrangement between them had increased to the point where they were almost enemies due to the accumulation of the cataclysm over the years, they were still sages from the same side, after all. The connection between them could not be severed. Therefore, when they heard the sage's invitation, none of the other sages hesitated. One by one, they quickly headed toward the dojo from all directions. The speed of the sages was extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, the 13 sages had gathered at the dojo. Everyone must have felt the pressure, right? At this moment, the sage who invited the sages over sighed. Hearing this, the expressions of the other sages changed slightly. Naturally, they all felt that kind of pressure. It was just that they had always treated it as a sign that the cultivators from the other side were about to do something and did not take it to heart. Now that they heard the words of the sage before them, it did not seem to be that simple. Stop talking nonsense. Fellow cultivator, feel free to tell us what you discovered. A straightforward sage said. Just as the sage who invited the sages over was about to say something, his expression suddenly changed. At this moment, the expressions of the other sages also changed drastically, as if they had discovered something. At this moment, an indescribable vibration swept across the void, causing the indescribable void to completely lose its original appearance. The original void was now completely filled with chaotic fluctuations, as if it was in a state of chaos. Looks like the result will be revealed soon. At this moment, a sage sighed. His figure flashed and disappeared from the dojo. He arrived at the border of the two worlds. The other sages also moved one by one, their figures quickly appearing at the border of the two worlds. They looked at the two worlds that were undergoing changes at this moment. Below them, the conflict between the two worlds that had been stagnant for billions of years had appeared once again. All the hard work that they had put in to turn the conflict into cataclysm had gone up in smoke. Not only that, it was as if the resentment that had been stagnant for billions of years was being vented out. This conflict was billions of times stronger than the most intense conflict between the two worlds in their memories. In the past, although the conflict between the two worlds was all-encompassing, there was a specific pattern in terms of intensity. For areas that had strong endurance, the conflict would be intense, while for areas that had weak endurance, the conflict would be mild. In this way, the destructive power of the two worlds would not suddenly increase to a point where one of the worlds could not withstand it. However, the situation was completely different this time. At this moment, the conflict between the two heavens and earth was no longer a full-scale one. Instead, it was directly compressed to the boundary between the two heavens and earth. The power of the conflict erupted millions of times here. It looked like two stones had brazenly collided with each other, causing countless fragments to fly in all directions. It was simply like the countless sparks produced by the collision of stones. Such a terrifying impact was a great disaster for both sides of the world. It was fine for the void outside of the two worlds, as it was only filled with fluctuations, causing the place to become chaotic. However, the impact produced by the explosion within the two worlds was not so simple. Under the impact of the fluctuations, the laws of the two worlds were instantly torn apart like pieces of paper. Time, space, matter, and energy also began to frantically collapse under the impact, becoming more and more chaotic. As for the clear chi and turbid chi that were immersed in the two poles of the world, they began to stir violently. They repelled each other, attracted each other, attacked each other, and devoured each other. It was like two extremely complicated opponents who loved and wanted to kill each other. However, the one that had the upper hand wasn't the world formed by the baleful aura, which was obviously larger in size. Instead, it was the world formed by Luo Fan. The reason for this was very simple. In the world formed by Luo Fan, whether it was the clear chi or the turbid chi, there was a spiritual light that contained the essence of the 8 sages. It was this spiritual light that supported the clear chi and turbid chi like a skeleton, which greatly increased the combat power of the clear chi and turbid chi, allowing them to gain the upper hand in the battle of different sizes. Chapter 2020. You'll find out very soon, the childlike saint said with a smile. However, his smile was not full of joy. There was also an indescribable sense of helplessness. Although it seemed like their camp had gained the upper hand, this was only to stop the losses. However, this was only a temporary measure. In fact, they would suffer great losses in the end. At least, compared to the previous cycles of cataclysm and immeasurable cataclysm, their situation would be like the difference between heaven and earth. His answer caused many of the sages on the other side to be filled with bewilderment. The two camps had been fighting and plotting for billions of years. Their understanding of each other had almost surpassed their own understanding of each other. Under such circumstances, they naturally knew that the childlike saint was speaking from the bottom of his heart. At this time, he was actually quite depressed. And this was even more incomprehensible to them. Since he was already so depressed, why did he still do this? However, since the other party had already said so, at this time, they would not be like ordinary people trying to figure out an answer. Instead, they all looked at the place where the two worlds clashed, watching the shocking chaos caused by this conflict, as well as the unimaginable changes. The conflict this time seemed to be the culmination of the countless small conflicts in the past, and it completely erupted. Even with the status and power of these saints, they could not alleviate the intensity of this conflict, let alone change it. They could only watch as the conflict progressed and wait for the final outcome. However, with such a conflict, the two worlds would never be separated again. The best outcome, in other words, the two worlds would completely merge into one and become a complete world. And the worst outcome would be that the two worlds could not withstand this kind of conflict. Under this kind of conflict, the two worlds would perish together. Both would be destroyed and perish. As for whether it was good or bad, it would be one world devouring the other world. After weighing the situation of the two worlds, all the saints in the camp of the 13 saints knew the plan of the opposing camp. It was obvious that they wanted to fix the result to be neither good nor bad. In the end, they wanted to adjust the result so that the opposing camp's world would completely devour their world. They were all saints and had strong thinking abilities. Needless to say, they quickly deduced what it would be like if the outcome were to develop to that point. At that time, although the sages who had lost their heaven and earth would not immediately be reduced to a lower realm and would not lose their status as sages, they would definitely lose their foundation and their strength would be greatly reduced. Opposite them were the sages of the opposing camp. Although it was impossible for one's own faction's heaven and earth to achieve a qualitative breakthrough by devouring another faction's heaven and earth, it was because the faction's heaven and earth had expanded and become stronger. It was equivalent to their origin receiving some sort of expansion, some sort of enhancement, and in the end, their power would definitely be greatly enhanced. Under such circumstances, the 13 sages would definitely not be able to fight back against the 8 sages. Perhaps they wouldn't kill him, but they would definitely seal him, perhaps one mishap. It could even be sealed into some kind of sage magical treasure or sage array formation weapon. After understanding this, the 13 sages looked at each other and saw a certain determination in each other's eyes. At this moment, the 13 sages attacked at the same time. Rays of light, gusts of clouds, and magical treasures, with a power that could destroy heaven and earth, blasted towards the 8 sages opposite them. If any of these attacks were to fall into either of the two worlds below, it would definitely cause that world to become extremely chaotic. It was even to the extent that all the laws would be completely minced and reconstructed. In the end, it would transform into a world that could completely adapt to this attack. It went without saying how terrifying such an attack was. Currently, these attacks complemented each other and boosted each other, pouncing towards the 8 sages in an extremely exquisite and mysterious manner. In an instant, it was as if billions of worlds had been created and billions of cycles of reincarnation were compressed and presented. It completely replaced the surrounding void that had been twisted into chaos by the fluctuations, turning this place into a strange place that was formed by an endless world. Faced with such an attack, even a sage would definitely not be able to remain unscathed. However, faced with such an attack, the 8 sages only smiled faintly. None of them resisted and directly used their own bodies to face the attack. In the end, under the incredulous gazes of the 13 saints, the 8 saints were directly struck by the countless attacks. Earth-shattering thunderbolts erupted, and incomparably terrifying shockwaves directly covered the countless undulations. Even the 2 sides of the world below trembled violently under the impact of the shockwaves and thunderbolts. The effects of the conflict became even more powerful and even faster. How could this be? The 13 sages watched this scene with their mouths agape. They felt as if their views of the world had been turned upside down. One must know that although this kind of attack could not completely wipe out a sage, it would definitely cause great damage to their vitality. It could even completely eliminate their power, leaving only a bit of their essence that could not be erased. Once it reached this stage, the sage would probably need at least trillions of years of recultivation to be able to recover all of his power. Normally, no saint would be able to accept this easily and enjoy this fate without any resistance. However, right in front of them, the 8 sages in front of them did so without hesitation. Looking at their final expressions, they even felt that this feeling was incomparably wonderful. Even though they were sages, they could not help but express their incomprehension at this moment. At this moment, endless black fog began to gush out from where the 8 sages were. After this black fog gushed out, it quickly condensed into a huge dark cloud. It began to surge and spread in all directions, covering more and more areas of nothingness, or rather, shrouded by the shock waves just now. The area that was filled with thunderbolts was completely covered. In the blink of an eye, this huge black fog had already completely covered the 2 world below. It even pounced towards the 13 sages, wanting to envelop them as well. What is this? At this moment, the 13 sages all had this question in their minds. Following this question, very quickly, they discovered that their bodies began to produce an indescribable attractive force, and they began to absorb this black fog. And with every bit of black fog that was absorbed, they felt their bodies become a little heavier. Very quickly, this kind of heaviness made them feel that their bodies had already become several times heavier. It was as if countless worlds had suddenly condensed into stones and pressed on top of their heads. This is the karma of heaven and earth. At this moment, a sage suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He let out such a loud shout. Such a loud shout instantly made all the other sages come to a sudden realization and understood what exactly was going on. Then, they immediately understood what exactly had happened just now. So this is your real plan. This kind of thought reverberated in the hearts of these sages. At this moment, they completely understood the faint smile on the 8 sages' faces when they were about to be hit. They were sages, their thinking ability was strong, and their knowledge was broad. There was no need to say anything more. Very quickly, they combined this karma of heaven and earth and the performance of the 8 sages. All of them had already understood all sorts of difficulties back then, and understood why they've been so uncomfortable and oppressed all these years. We were wrong. In the end, all of the sages sighed one after another. Following this soft sigh, one by one, they opened up their bodies and began to actively absorb the endless karma of heaven and earth around them. They continuously condensed the karma of heaven and earth into their bodies, trying their best to reduce the endless karma of heaven and earth around them. This karma of heaven and earth was the karma of the sages, and this kind of karma could even harm the sages. To the heaven and earth, to the void around them, they were all fatal. If they did not care about this karma and let it work on them, under the attack of this karma, not only them, but even the heaven and earth would be greatly damaged. In the end, it might even completely collapse and perish. When that time came, the sages would not even be able to retain a single bit of their foundation, and they might even sink into oblivion forever. If the countless karma of heaven and earth were added to the mix, they would probably suffer endless torment as they sank into oblivion, as if they were being tortured by 1,000 cuts every single moment. In comparison, they were now actively absorbing the karma of heaven and earth. Although they would bear more karma of heaven and earth, because of this, the two worlds and the void would not be completely destroyed because of this. Although their foundation would be damaged, it would not be completely destroyed, and they would not sink into oblivion in the end. In the end, they would still have various ways to reduce the influence of the karma of heaven and earth on them. Compared to the previous situation, this was clearly a better choice. We've really been schemed to death. At this moment, the sages only had such helpless thoughts in their hearts. It was clearly the other party who had placed the karma of heaven and earth on them. But not only could they not resist, they had to actively cooperate and attract the karma of heaven and earth over and suppress it within their bodies. This was a feeling of agony that went without saying. If not for the fact that they were all sages and were unimaginably rational, they might have even adopted the response of perishing together with the other party's camp. Of course, this was also within the calculations of the sages in the other party's camp. In the boundless dark clouds, 8 faintly discernible spots of spiritual light turned at this moment and directly shot towards the world that Luo Fan had transformed into. These 8 spots of spiritual light were none other than the essence of the 8 sages. They had endured the strongest attacks from the 13 sages without holding back. Apart from this bit of essence, everything else in their bodies had completely collapsed, including their bodies, spirits, life source, and even the concept of existence on a deeper level. Everything had completely collapsed. It could be said that among the 8 of them, only this faintly discernible bit of essence was left. In fact, in reality, it could be said that this bit of essence did not even exist. It was precisely because this bit of essence was left that they could break away from the countless karma of heaven and earth that had entangled them, allowing this bit of essence to regain its freedom and no longer be shackled by the karma of heaven and earth. However, in this way, it was equivalent to completely abandoning everything. Now, that only this bit of essence was left, if the sages wanted to be resurrected, they could only reincarnate. They had to turn into ordinary living creatures and use the identity of ordinary living creatures to grow and cultivate again. Whether he could reach this step again and become a sage again would depend on his luck in the future. Of course, although it still depended on their opportunities, after all, they still had the essence of a sage. Compared to real, ordinary living creatures, it would be much easier in the end. It could be said that they had made such a response. Although the 8 sages were slightly better than the 13 sages, there was a limit to how much better they were. If not for the fact that they were sages and had unimaginably strong minds, it was impossible for them to make such a decisive decision. The power of a sage was extremely terrifying, even when it came to absorbing the karma of heaven and earth. This pitch-black karma was endless, almost completely covering the 2 sides of the world. However, in the end, it was still completely absorbed by the 13 sages. After an unknown period of time, the void became clear again. Apart from the 13 majestic and mysterious sages who seemed to have turned into 13 demons, there was no one else in the void. Everything else almost made one suspect that time had returned to the time when the 2 sides of the world had just been born. The traces of the battle that had existed in the void for billions of years had completely disappeared, as if they had never existed. The 13 sages looked at the black fog on each other's bodies that they could not completely retract, even if they used all their strength. Then, They lowered their heads to look at the two sides of the world that had merged into one, and their expressions were full of bitterness. As expected, taking advantage of this opportunity, our world has already been devoured. One of the sages sighed. His voice was extremely hoarse and unpleasant to hear, as if it came from the depths of hell. Anyone who heard it would naturally feel an indescribable sense of disgust. This was obviously the result of absorbing too much of the karma of heaven and earth. The other sages were not surprised by his voice at all. Being entangled by the endless karma of heaven and earth, it was really normal for such a change to occur. At this moment, all of them frowned as they looked at the world that had been formed by the merger of the two sides of the world, as if they were having a headache about what to do. During the time when they were constantly absorbing the karma of heaven and earth, the final result of the conflict between their side's world and the other side's world was already out. Just as they had expected the other side's world, they had obtained a complete victory. That side of the world had completely devoured their side's world. It had devoured everything without leaving anything out. Now, the two sides of the world had become a world that was larger than any of the original worlds. It was like a huge ball that floated below them, filling up their entire sensing range. In this huge world, everything that had originally existed had disappeared. At this moment, the world had completely turned into two streams of air. One was clear, the other was turbid. The two streams of air were circulating endlessly in an extremely mysterious manner. As they came into contact with each other, they gradually gave birth to the four basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy. When these four basic existences interacted, they began to give birth to all sorts of indescribable rules. Gradually, these four basic existences returned to their positions, causing the originally chaotic world to gradually produce order, gradually forming a world that was becoming more and more complete and orderly. Why has this world become so much stronger? Suddenly, among the 13 sages who were watching all of this, another one cried out in shock. This voice was also extremely unpleasant to the ears, causing anyone who heard it to naturally feel a sense of disgust. However, when the other sages heard this, it was as if they had heard the truth, and their expressions all became stern. After the two worlds merged, it should have been strengthened, but how did it reach this stage? Now, even we can't shake the rules and laws of this world. Another sage said with an ugly expression, if Luo Fan was here, he would know that after the world he had created had devoured the world formed from the evil aura of the other side. Its level had already risen to the level of the universe. Compared to the perfect heaven and earth that were close to the 9 tribulations, although the great heaven and earth was only slightly stronger from an absolute point of view, it was already a leap in essence, causing the gap between the two to reach a level that no living creature could imagine. Not to mention other things, if it was a perfect world that was close to the 9 tribulations world, even if it was already extremely powerful, with the power of the 13 sages, they could still make adjustments to it, adjusting the rules and laws to the most suitable state for them. However, even if they had just crossed the boundary of the universe, the rules and laws of this world were already no longer something that these sages could shake. In fact, in a certain aspect, these sages might not even be able to fully understand the rules and laws of this universe. Chapter 2021. The spiritual light quickly condensed and finally transformed into a mysterious existence. It was like a halo, a mirror, a calm surface of water, and more like a lake in one's heart. In essence, the spiritual light that rushed out from the clear and turbid chi came from the 8 sages on this side. However, now that the 8 sages had turned into a bit of their essence and entered this world to be reincarnated, the spiritual light had already lost its will to control and began to evolve towards its most fundamental direction. In the end, it gradually lost the characteristics of the 8 sages. Originally, it was impossible for the spiritual light to condense and take shape at this time. The result they should have was that the spiritual light would gradually collapse between the clear and turbid chis and eventually completely merge into the 2 chis, slightly changing the two chis so that this newly born world would be able to lean towards the owners of the spiritual light, which was the eight sages. If that was really the case, the reincarnated bodies of the eight sages would naturally be able to obtain shocking luck. At that time, they would definitely have countless fortuitous encounters, and their cultivation realm would increase like a rocket. Perhaps in just a few 100 million years, they would be able to overcome countless obstacles and become sages again. This was also the original plan of the eight sages. However, it was obvious that from the looks of it, this kind of thing would never happen again. Now that the spiritual light had condensed into one and transformed into this appearance, it gradually revealed a characteristic that was completely different from the original eight sages. It was as if there was an even more profound and mysterious existence hidden behind the eight sages, as if it was controlling everything. At this moment, the 13 sages suddenly burst into laughter. I didn't expect that after scheming for so long, we would end up benefiting someone else in the end. To be able to toy with us sages in the palm of your hand, I have to admit defeat. Among the 13 sages, one of them laughed and said, there was a kind of gloating expression on his face. There was also an indescribable sense of defeat. There was even a vague sense of relief. At this moment, the other sages also had similar expressions. As sages, their thinking ability, observation ability, and sensing ability naturally did not need to be mentioned. Once this situation occurred, they already understood that they, including the 8 sages on the opposite side, had actually been schemed against. In the end, the one who reaped the most benefits from this battle, it was not the 8 saints, nor was it them. Instead, it was the existence hidden behind them, the main body of that ball of spiritual light. That's true. This was an existence that had been hiding behind the two worlds for countless trillions of years and had never appeared before. In the face of such a powerful and scheming existence, they were still able to maintain their true sage bodies and laugh as they commented on everything that had happened. Wasn't that a great fortune? In comparison, although the 8 saints seemed to have obtained victory, they had become extremely weak and did not even have the ability to resist. If the existence hidden behind them wanted to make a move, they would definitely die without a burial place. From this point of view, it seemed that they were in a better situation. This sudden reversal made the sages feel extremely complicated. They felt that their billions of years of cultivation seemed to have become a dream. At this moment, the mirror-like light in a world formed by the two worlds gradually surged and changed. In the end, the shape of a bronze mirror was formed. There was a chaotic world inside the bronze mirror, and there seemed to be countless lights and shadows flickering. It also seemed like everything in the world was randomly combining. It was none other than the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure that had been added with the perfect world template. After the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure reappeared, the world seemed to have a center of gravity. The entire world that was originally changing violently began to gradually stabilize. The world that originally seemed to be evolving in countless directions and eventually underwent countless conflicts before finally stabilizing seemed to have suddenly obtained a template. It began to bypass the countless changes and directly evolved towards the final result. And the result of this evolution was none other than a boundless starry sky. There were countless stars in this starry sky, including countless planets, stars, nebulas, and void that could give birth to life. Although the entire world had just been formed, there was already endless vitality brewing within it. Living beings began to be born in the many planets, stars, nebulas, and void. At this time, the clear and turbid chi in this world had already undergone a tremendous change. The turbid chi that had originally condensed into a ball of turbid chi had scattered into countless tiny parts and integrated into the stars, becoming the center of the stars, so that the stars wouldn't collapse and could exist stably for a long time. The clear chi spread out and directly turned into a boundless sky, wrapping the countless stars and becoming the void of the universe. Or it could be said that it had become the common sky of the countless stars. Such a scene, such a structure, was mysterious and wonderful, containing endless mysteries. It was enough to make any living being feel a sense of shock after seeing it. When this world was first born, the rules and laws weren't stable. Every rule and law seemed to explore in countless directions before determining a certain direction of evolution. After countless failures, they finally stabilized in a certain state. And in such failures, a new race would be born every time. A race that adapted to the failed rules and laws and didn't adapt to the final stable rules and laws, but was still incomparably powerful. These races, some were strong and some were weak. The strong ones, some were even born with the ability to change the stars and destroy the world. As for the weak ones, even if they grew to their peak, they still couldn't leave the stars and survive in the void of the universe. Such endless races continued to wither away and be destroyed as the rules and laws adjusted. In the end, only a legend was left among the races of the later generations, just like the ancient races in the legends of any world. Of course, there were some powerful living beings that could survive in different rules and laws. In the end, they evolved into secret realms and became a threat to the races of the later generations. It's our turn. At this moment, the 13 sages sighed. Although they were sages, they were entangled by the endless karma of the world. Under the circumstances where they couldn't completely leave this world, they naturally had to enter it and contribute their strength to the evolution of this world. That was the only way. Only then would they have the chance to eliminate the karma of the world and finally regain their position as sages. Therefore, they have been watching the evolution of this world and the countless living beings. Countless races constantly reincarnated. This was obviously not desirable. Even ordinary cultivators could see this, let alone sages like them. The 13 sages bid each other farewell and immediately separated, transforming into 13 wisps of black gas. Descending from the sky, they plunged into the 13 locations that were extremely far away from each other. This was a huge world. The level of the rules and laws was not something that these sages could change. Moreover, these sages still had the endless karma of the world to drag them down. Under such circumstances, the moment they entered this world, their minds were completely blinded by this world. It was as if they had transformed into 13 ordinary forces that were absorbed into the reincarnation cycle by this world. They immediately collapsed and turned into 13 fiend celestial races. These fiend celestial races seemed to be despised by this world the moment they were born. The degree of their bad luck was simply outrageous. Even if they had earth-shattering strength and had the power to destroy the world, almost any other race could completely develop means to deal with these fiend celestial races. In fact, their bodies and strength were rare treasures to almost all other races. Under such circumstances, the birth of these 13 fiend celestial races seemed to have given the other races in this world 13 places to harvest treasures. In an instant, the winds and clouds surged. Countless races continuously gathered towards those 13 locations and began to harvest these fiend celestial races wantonly. However, in this process, these fiend celestial races still continued to develop and strengthen. In the end, they grew into colossal beings and began to become a huge threat to the entire universe. This caused the other races in the universe to gradually unite and begin to fight against these 13 fiend celestial races. This was the reason why the first universe war broke out. This cosmic war was the first super large-scale war since this world was completely formed. In this war, 8 powerhouses stood out and gradually grew into 8 universe emperors. Under the leadership of these 8 universe emperors, the entire universe worked together and finally beat the 13 fiend celestial races back into their ancestral lands, making them unable to invade again. However, because the environment of those ancestral lands was incomparably harsh and the fiend celestial races had an indescribable affinity with them, even the 8 universe emperors were unable to attack and completely wipe out the 13 fiend celestial races. In the end, after tens of millions of years, when the 13 fiend celestial races finished recuperating and finally had enough power, the Second Universe War broke out. Because of the previous experience, under the leadership of the 8 Universe Emperors, the 13 Fiend Celestial races were finally forced back into the 13 ancestral lands of the Fiend Celestial races after tens of thousands of years. Just like the previous time, due to the uniqueness of the ancestral lands, they were still unable to completely wipe out the 13 Fiend Celestial races. In this way, a strange cycle was formed. Cosmic wars broke out again and again like catastrophes, appearing in this part of the world and becoming the main melody of this part of the world. In every cosmic war, there would be countless heroes who were worthy of respect and admiration. There were also countless children of Providence who went on a journey of cultivation that would make any cultivator envious, becoming incredibly powerful existences in this part of the world. The entire world. Because of the universe wars, the cultivation world of the entire universe was constantly developing. Because of the universe wars, it was constantly developing. In the beginning, it was only in its initial form. But in the end, after tens of thousands of universe wars, the entire cultivation world had already advanced to the point where sages were about to be born among them. There were those who had the highest hopes of becoming sages. Obviously, they were the 8 Universe Emperors. These 8 Universe Emperors had gone through tens of thousands of universe wars. They had already controlled large areas of the star fields. Each suppressed a few Fiend Celestial races, protected the entire universe, and obtained the respect of all living beings. These 8 Universe Emperors were none other than the 8 sages who only had the essence of a sage left. However, he and the 8 sages had yet to fully recover their memories of being sages. To them, it was a different story. Perhaps they could vaguely remember that they were extremely amazing existences in their previous lives, but that was all. To them, they were now just the universe emperors of this universe. Their enemies, just the 13 Fiend Celestial races. This state of theirs would continue for a long time. Only when they completely broke through and became saints again would they be able to regain all their memories and return to their original selves. In the eyes of ordinary people, this would naturally be a form of reincarnation with great hidden dangers. It would even make people doubt whether they would still be themselves after reincarnation. But for existences at the level of sages, this was not a problem at all. After all, to a saint, a trillion years was just a blink of an eye. Losing one's memory in a trillion years was just like an ordinary person's brain being muddled for a moment and suddenly going blank for a moment. What was the big deal about that? As for whether they would still be themselves after this, there was even less to say. As long as the essence of a sage remained unchanged, then they would definitely be themselves. It was precisely because of this concept that these sages would choose such a method to reincarnate. Time gradually flowed by. Unknowingly, the number of cosmos wars had already increased to 12,960 times. This time, when the 8 Universe Emperors finally drove the 13 Fiend Celestial races back to their ancestral lands, an indescribable feeling suddenly appeared in the hearts of the 8 Universe Emperors. In a daze, they seemed to feel a huge sun appear above their heads. Endless mysterious power began to emit from the sun, slowly entering their bodies and fusing with their life source. It fused with their indescribable essence, causing it to strengthen at an indescribable speed. It's finally begun. Such an inexplicable thought appeared in the hearts of the 8 Universe Emperors at the same time. As such changes occurred to their bodies, the entire universe began to undergo indescribable changes. Boundless immortal music spread out in all directions with the 8 of them as the center. An indescribably mysterious light was born from nothingness, rendering the originally pitch-black void of the universe into a strange, radiant fairyland. All the cultivators and all the living beings came to a sudden realization that the world would never be the same again. When they realized this, all the living beings felt indescribably complicated. They seemed sour, fearful, joyful, and even more so, expectant the earth-shattering upheaval would inevitably leave a deep mark in any living being's heart. Such a deep mark would naturally cause the living being's emotions to change. With the complexity of the human heart, Such a change naturally couldn't be completely unified. The auras of the 8 universe emperors began to rise at an unimaginable speed. They had already reached an indescribable peak that could practically suppress everything. Now that their auras continued to rise, even the cultivators closest to them couldn't clearly see through them. They couldn't even understand their existence. The Sage Realm, here I come again. The universe emperors, under the urging of some indescribable emotion, spoke in unison. As they spoke, their bodies began to emit 7 colored rays of light. The rainbow light contained a special quality that no living being in this world had ever sensed before. It was a quality that was eternal and indestructible. All the living beings enveloped by the rainbow light felt as if they had received an indescribable baptism. Even their souls seemed to have risen to a higher level. In a trance, they felt as if they could see the end of their cultivation, the ultimate goal of their cultivation. As these changes continued and the 8 universe emperors gradually approached the Sage Realm, a copper mirror appeared out of nowhere at a certain moment. The copper mirror was located in an empty space. Its position had nothing to do with the 8 universe emperors. In fact, if the 8 universe emperors were to be regarded as the center of the universe, then the copper mirror could be regarded as the edge of the universe. However, in such a position, the appearance of the bronze mirror gave off the feeling that it was hanging high above the heads of the 8 universe emperors. It naturally gave off a supreme quality, causing the 8 universe emperors, who were originally climbing towards the Saint Realm, to suddenly feel as if there was an additional layer of the sky above their heads. They took the initiative to climb, and it was as if they were throwing themselves towards the sky. Chapter 2022. The mirror didn't care about them at all. At this moment, it was like it had turned into a black hole, producing a suction force that even the 8 universe emperors couldn't resist at all. Under this suction force, the 8 universe emperors felt an indescribable existence start to rapidly leave their bodies and fly towards the mirror. As this indescribable existence continuously left their bodies, the 8 universe emperors felt that the supreme, eternal, and indestructible realm that was originally so close to them seemed to be getting further and further away from them. The feeling of being forced down from their peak made the 8 universe emperors feel an indescribable sense of fear and hatred. "Who the hell is it?" they roared one after another. Their roars resounded throughout the entire universe, entering the ears of all living beings in the universe, causing them to be extremely shocked. They had no idea what kind of shocking change had happened to cause the 8 universe emperors to suddenly become like this. At this moment, within the copper mirror, a curled-up figure gradually materialized from nothingness, gradually appearing in the mist. The figure quietly laid there, hugging its knees with its back arched like a bow. It looked like a fetus in its mother's womb. As the incomparably mysterious existence from the 8 universe emperors continuously poured into the mirror, the figure became clearer and clearer. It also became more and more solid. At the same time, the entire world started to tremble slightly. Vaguely, there seemed to be all sorts of indescribable things gathering towards the mirror from all directions, constantly pouring into it and fusing into the figure. This caused the speed at which the figure solidified to become even faster. The 8 great cosmos emperors had spent so many years to reach this step, but this mirror had only taken a few days to reach this stage. It had directly forced them back to the time when they were first born. It even caused their bodies to gradually collapse at this moment, gradually dissipating into the world, producing all sorts of incomparably sacred, incomparably beautiful, and even incomparably mysterious phenomena. If it wasn't for the horrified roars of the 8 universe emperors, perhaps the living beings in this world would have thought that this was a phenomenon that would inevitably appear when the 8 of them became saints. But at this moment, those living beings were only filled with terror and astonishment, because, combined with that roar and the current scene, they could tell that this was a sign that the cultivation bases of the 8 universe great emperors were collapsing. Due to the collapse of their cultivation bases, the 8 universe emperors were unable to control the power that they could control as they pleased. In the end, the power had no choice but to leave their bodies and dissipate into the surroundings. Because of this, it created all sorts of indescribable phenomena around the 8 universe emperors. This scene caused the countless living beings in this world to gradually form a psychological shadow in their hearts. That was, when they rose to the level of these 8 universe emperors, they would inevitably walk towards destruction and destruction. One could imagine that after this, the cultivation world of this world would definitely suffer a heavy blow. At least, at the false saint level and above, all cultivators would definitely be filled with anticipation and fear towards the cultivation of the great emperor of the universe. As expected, he's made his move. At this moment, a sigh that no living being could hear came from the depths of the 13 demon god races. The 13 demon god races were formed from the 13 sages, but this didn't mean that they had completely abandoned everything. In reality, the 13 sages still had a bit of clarity and a bit of will left to sense everything in this world. In other words, their bodies and everything else were obeying the cycle of reincarnation in this world. But after that, they still had a bit of consciousness that was watching everything unfold. They could sense how much of the boundless negative karma that originally existed in their bodies had been whittled away by the demon god race that they had transformed into. That's right. The most fundamental reason why the 13 sages had transformed into the demon god races was to wear away the endless karma that existed in their bodies. The karma of heaven and earth had appeared because they had obstructed the growth of the two worlds. Under such circumstances, the best way to eliminate the karma of heaven and earth was to use one's everything to make up for the world and help it grow. Through this, one could obtain endless merit of heaven and earth and finally neutralize the karma of heaven and earth, allowing them to regain their freedom and step into the sage realm again. Of course, there was just too much negative karma. By transforming into 13 fiend celestial races and using another method to help the heaven and earth evolve and grow, they were indeed able to obtain quite a bit of merit each time and neutralize quite a bit of negative karma. However, at this speed, they would need at least 1 trillion cosmic wars before they had a chance of completely neutralizing all the negative karma. Even these sages couldn't ignore this speed. All along, although the 13 sages had been paying attention to the development of the situation in this universe, they had actually been constantly looking forward to the birth of this scene today. The 8 sages who had schemed against the 13 of them were unlucky. Now that they saw him, all of them were gloating over his misfortune, but they were also extremely vigilant. They were naturally gloating because the essence of the 8 sages had been extracted and taken away. As for being extremely vigilant, there was no need to talk about it. They were worried that what the 8 sages had experienced would happen to them at some point. Fortunately, the development of the situation didn't quickly develop to the point where the 13 sages felt despair. Just as the 8 sages lost their bodies and power, and even their essence was greatly damaged, the suction produced by the mirror gradually disappeared. At this moment, the strange phenomena that kept appearing around the 8 emperors, the terrifying power that kept leaking out, they gradually dissipated. Along with them dissipated, the 8 emperors also disappeared from then on. No traces of their existence could be found in this universe. It was as if the 8 of them had never appeared in the first place. The emperors have died, some cultivators murmured. Their expressions were filled with disbelief. They were filled with disbelief. One must know that the 8 emperors could originally be called the strongest, noblest, and most inconceivable existences in the entire universe. To the countless living beings in the universe, the 8 of them were the strongest protectors, as well as the strongest shackles. Not only did they make the living beings in the universe feel safe, but they also constantly attacked their enthusiasm for cultivation. This caused the hearts of countless living beings to be shackled by the traces of the 8 emperors' power. Under such circumstances, the sudden disappearance of the 8 emperors caused the living beings to be at a loss for a moment. However, very soon, they didn't need to choose, because a new change had already occurred. At this moment, The mirror that had absorbed the mysterious existence from the 8 emperors suddenly began to violently tremble. The figure that was curled up inside the mirror, like a mother in a womb, began to gradually stretch its body. It was like a newborn baby that was beginning to explore the outside world for the first time. At this moment, this figure had already become incomparably clear. It was impressively Luo Fan's appearance. "You've finally condensed a bit of your will." A voice that seemed to come from the deepest depths of the mist came from the figure. Then, Luo Fan's figure flickered, and his figure appeared outside the copper mirror, which was also his half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. That's right, the one here was indeed Luo Fan, whose body had been brazenly shattered and turned into a world. To be more precise, it was a bit of his will. Luo Fan looked at the vast and boundless starry sky in front of him. Memories of how the two worlds had fought over the countless trillions of years, how they had evolved, and how they had finally condensed flashed through his mind. These countless trillions of years of memories contained an endless amount of information. Normally speaking, even if it was Luo Fan's main body, it would take him hundreds of millions of years to completely sort out all this information. He even had to be extremely careful in the process. Otherwise, the slightest mistake could cause his body to explode from the information. But at this moment, the bit of will that was here did not feel the slightest bit of strain. In fact, with just a thought, when he wanted to understand the countless memories, those memories had already directly appeared in his mind and directly integrated into his memories. The entire process was so smooth that it was beyond common sense. It was as if these memories had originally been in his heart. However, when he thought about how this world came to be, perhaps he could understand why this situation was like this. After all, this world was evolved from everything he had. Even if the world evolved from the other baleful aura was fundamentally different, after being devoured, its essence had changed and become a part of this world evolved from his body. In this way, everything that happened here naturally happened to him. It was not wrong to say that all the memories were originally in his heart. Luckily, I have a treasure. Otherwise, I'm afraid I really would have died this time. After understanding the endless memories, Luo Fan suddenly felt incomparably lucky. As he spoke, he lightly waved his hand, and the half-step primordial origin spirit treasure entered his body, fusing with him. As this treasure fused with him, his body suddenly emitted an indescribable aura. The bit of illusion that originally existed had completely disappeared in the blink of an eye. What replaced it was an unimaginable reality and stability, a reality and stability that surpassed the entire world. In fact, during these countless trillions of years, he had been in a daze. His own will have been completely integrated into the world, constantly reincarnating with all things in the world. If there was no accident, his will would become independent in this reincarnation. In the end, it would be impossible for his will to fuse again. He would truly become all the living beings in this world. At that time, as Luo Fan's existence. Naturally, it would be equivalent to death, and his soul would scatter. This was also one of the calamities of this time's calamities. Fortunately, he had this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. Even though his fourth tribulation contained limitless power and could easily shatter everything he had and open up a new world for himself, it was impossible for him to do so. But this did not mean it could completely destroy this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. In fact, under that punch, although this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure seemed to have been shattered along with Luo Fan and turned into all the living beings in this world, that was only the appearance. As a half-step primordial origin spirit treasure, its innate essence was eternal and indestructible. It wasn't something that could be erased so easily. At that time, this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure seemed to have been scattered into countless fragments. It seemed to have evolved into all the living beings in this world, but its essence still did not change from beginning to end. In other words, it was just that the originally complete copper mirror had turned into countless fragments. In essence, it was still a half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. As long as Luo Fan thought about it, it could naturally condense and turn into a complete half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. It was also because of this that the will that Luo Fan placed in this half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure was able to maintain its essence. In order to maintain his consciousness, he used the essence of the saint that was condensed from the achievement of the saint, which could fight against the heavens and earth, to finally awaken that bit of his will, which led to the current scene. As for the various schemes from before, although they were related to him, it was more because his own essence affected the nature of the world. It had little to do with his own will. In other words, all of this was actually the result of the natural operation of the world. It was fundamentally different from what the 13 sages thought that he was scheming behind the scenes. As for why he had to rely on the moment when the 8 universe emperors became sages to absorb the essence of the sages, there was no need to explain. This was because at other times the essence of the 8 sages was eternally stable. Even if he had the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure, he could not shake it at all. Only at the moment when they became sages, when the essence of the sage was quickly born, could there be a way to absorb this essence before it was stable. This was also the only reason why the process of the 8 universe emperors becoming sages failed. Luo Fan's will took form in the void. His realm was still close to the level of a 4th tribulation powerhouse, like his main body. However, in this world, he had an indescribable sense of nobility and power. It was as if any living thing in this world, even if it was a saint, could not pose any threat to him. They could not truly hurt him at all. The reason for this was very simple. It was because this expanse of the world was practically formed by him. Everything in this world, including the sages, actually belonged to him. Under such circumstances, if the sages wanted to attack him, wouldn't it be like a part of a person's body wanting to attack him? As long as he did not want to commit suicide, he would subconsciously hold back, and it would be impossible for him to be fatally injured. Because of this, when he stood in the void, his presence naturally spread throughout the entire universe. This made all living beings in this world clearly know that an extremely noble existence had appeared in this world. For a moment, everyone was at a loss, but the uneasiness in their hearts had already unknowingly decreased by a lot. I have to recondense all the concepts of my existence. Luo Fan naturally did not pay too much attention to the changes in everyone's emotions. At this moment, he was only thinking about how to get through this tribulation. Compared to the previous few tribulations, this one was special from the beginning. In the previous tribulations that he had encountered, the attacks usually went from weak to strong. Only towards the end of the tribulations would the attacks become stronger. However, this time's tribulations were completely different. In this tribulation, he had suffered a terrifying attack that was far beyond the peak of the previous tribulations. Even now, when he thought of that punch, he was still shocked beyond words. He even suspected that it was a punch from someone who had surpassed the true divine level. After all, even if it was a true saint attacking, he could still feel the mysteries within it. However, he could not see through the mysteries of that fist at all. He actually felt that it was just an ordinary punch from an ordinary person. After that, the tribulations made him try his best to escape from the consequences caused by that punch, and try his best to come back to life in the scene caused by that punch. The entire process was almost the complete opposite of the previous tribulations. No matter how one looked at it, it could only be said to be strange. All sorts of thoughts flashed through his mind. Luo Fan raised his eyes and looked at the ancestral lands of the 13 demon god clans. At this moment, his eyes penetrated countless obstacles, illuminated endless space-time, crossed the infinite laws, and directly saw the 13 sages hidden in the 13 ancestral lands. Or rather, it was the remnant will of the 13 sages. Chapter 2023. Looks like we've reached the end. One of the sages sighed and said. Hearing his words, the other sages also revealed an inexplicable expression. They seemed to be a little regretful and unwilling. After all, they were all sages. Even if they were already afraid, they wouldn't lose their composure. You're the cancer of this world. Luo Fan said lightly. His words were transmitted into the depths of the ancestral lands of the 13 fiend celestial races and into the ears of the 13 saints. It caused their minds to tremble, causing them to suddenly feel as though the entire world was suppressing them and repelling them. It was as though they could not wait for them to die immediately. What a high level of authority. The 13 sages had the same thought. With this thought, the 13 of them each took action. As sages, they naturally couldn't lose their will to resist just because of words. They couldn't surrender just because they felt that the opponent was stronger than them. At this moment, the 13 of them had already thrown all their previous plans to the back of their minds. At this moment, their sage's essence began to vibrate and began to resonate with all the power they emitted. Then, they slowly withdrew their own power. As they withdrew their own power, the living beings in the ancestral lands of the 13 demon god clans began to collapse, turning into the purest power and quickly gathering towards them. In a short while, the embryonic forms of 13 sages' bodies were constructed. During this process, the laws of the entire world began to tremble violently. Huge tribulation clouds condensed in the void of the universe, covering the ancestral lands of the 13 demon god clans. Waves of extremely terrifying pressure began to emit from the tribulation clouds, suppressing the 13 regions. It suppressed the 13 sages in the 13 regions. If the 13 sages were in the same state as before, their own power would be helping the world perfect itself. In this way, it would be equivalent to atoning for their crimes by performing meritorious deeds. Although they had endless negative karma, the world wouldn't do anything to them. However, at this moment, when they condensed their own power again and constructed their sages' bodies, it was as if they had directly given up the opportunity to atone for their crimes by performing meritorious deeds. How could the world let them off? Naturally, tribulation clouds appeared. These tribulation clouds were condensed from almost all the destructive power in the world. The power itself was so terrifying that it had reached an unimaginable level. Even if these sages were in peak condition, they would not be able to hold on for long, not to mention that they had only barely condensed the body of a sage. Their original strength was not even 1/100th of their original strength. At that moment, the 13 sages felt a strong sense of life or death crisis shrouding their minds, causing them to tremble instinctively. This kind of trembling was something that even their sage wills could not suppress. At this moment, the 13 of them knew very well that if they didn't take action and waited a little longer, they would all die. He would no longer have the chance to attack. Understanding this, the 13 of them let out a soft cry, completely ignoring the tribulation clouds that hung high above their heads. Each of them launched their strongest attacks at Luo Fan's location. These sages were all in different shapes and forms, so naturally, their attacking methods were also different. These were the most powerful attacks they could unleash. Some were fists, some were palms, some were magic treasures, some were rays of light, some were air currents, and some were physical objects. But no matter what kind of attack, they were definitely at the level of a saint. Under these kinds of attacks, the rules and laws in this part of the world seemed to be constantly rubbed by an invisible hand, becoming extremely chaotic. And that space-time. During this process, it began to become extremely chaotic. All of a sudden, it was kneaded into a ball. In the blink of an eye, it turned into countless pieces. In the blink of an eye, it seemed to be randomly glued together again. The chaos and strangeness of the scene had reached an unimaginable level. Facing such a situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. If this part of the world was only at the level of a perfect world, then even he could only escape in the face of such an attack. After all, although these sages were not real sages, they were not much different from real sages in this tribulation. Under such circumstances, even if one could completely condense the power of the entire world, it would not be able to resist their strongest attack. In fact, not only could it not be resisted, but even this part of the world would be completely destroyed by their strongest attack. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan, whose realm was not comparable to that of the 13 sages, resist it? However, it was obvious that this part of the world was not only at the level of a perfect world. After the world formed by Luo Fan devoured the world formed by the baleful aura, this part of the world had surpassed its limit and reached the level of a great world. Because he had surpassed the level of a great world, Luo Fan, who could almost control this part of the world like he controlled his own body, could naturally erupt with even more terrifying power, which was enough to resist the attacks of the 13 sages at this moment. Rays of mysterious light condensed in the void and condensed into 13 rays of spiritual light in front of Luo Fan. They split into 13 directions and charged forward. The 13 directions were all different. Under normal circumstances, it was impossible for them to come into contact with the attacks of the 13 sages. However, it was obvious that the mysteries contained in the mysterious light were enough to offset the different directions. At this moment, in a flash, it had already crossed space-time and collided with the 13 attacks. There was no sound, but at this moment, the whole world seemed to shake. In the starry sky of the universe, the stars and the void around the 13 battlefields were instantly destroyed. In the blink of an eye, nearly half of the whole world had collapsed. All the living beings, all the stars, and all the matter were completely annihilated. Not even dust could be formed. The starry sky had completely disappeared at the same time. It was unknown how many worlds and space-times there were. Countless strange things were born from impact caused by the collision. This was simply like the 13 battlefields, as if the 13 gods of creation were splitting the world apart. The countless worlds kept piling up and rolled out in all directions like sand. It seemed as if it was going to completely devour and replace the whole world. At this moment, this part of the world suddenly shook, and an endless amount of mysterious power was produced from everywhere in this world. It began to quickly gather towards the 13 shock waves, gradually annihilating the many worlds, space-times, and other indescribable things at the same time. Waves of black aura gathered above the heads of the 13 sages, causing the 13 retribution clouds to become bigger and darker. The pressure they emitted became even more intense. The retribution clouds were born from the karma of the world. The 13 sages had destroyed more than half of the space-time in the world. It went without saying how strong the negative karma that was triggered was. How could such karma not strengthen the tribulation that the 13 sages were facing? In the end, Luo Fan's 13 spiritual lights couldn't destroy the sages' attacks, and then rushed towards the sages' bodies. At this moment, the 13 rays of spiritual light had already disappeared along with the attacks of the 13 sages. In the blink of an eye, it was as if they had completely ceased to exist. Facing such a change, the 13 sages were about to attack again. Unfortunately, at this moment, the retribution clouds in the sky had already reacted. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning that seemed to distort the space-time in the area around the retribution clouds was completely separated from the outside world. It looked as if it was a completely different world. The bolt of lightning was as black as ink. As soon as it appeared, the bodies of the 13 sages began to collapse. As for the space-time, it began to distort crazily. The past, present, and future began to interweave in a strange manner under the lightning, forming a strange scene that could not be described with words. The lightning was obviously trying to erase the past, present, and future of the sages at the same time. Endless power erupted from the bodies of the 13 sages. Infinite mysterious light, spiritual light, airflow, power, rules, laws, and so on began to erupt from their bodies. While they continued to condense all kinds of indescribable defenses, they also produced all kinds of shocking destructive power that went against the lightning. Unfortunately, all of this had no effect on the lightning at all. These bolts of lightning seemed to have broken through layers of illusions and landed easily on the bodies of the 13 sages. As the lightning landed, the bodies of the 13 sages trembled. Regardless of which body they were in, their past, present, or future began to collapse. Immediately after, their souls, their sage powers, their sage essence, and even their concept of existence began to collapse at this moment. In a short span of a breath, the 13 sages had completely disappeared as if they had never appeared. The retribution clouds began to gradually dissipate. As the 13 locations returned to their normal state of clarity, the 13 ancestral lands of the demon god race had completely disappeared. 13 completely empty areas appeared out of thin air. At this moment, Luo Fan felt as if his entire body had become light. It was as if a heavy weight that had been pressing down on his heart had disappeared. The rare feeling of relaxation made him involuntarily reveal an inexplicable smile. However, he did not maintain such a smile for too long. His mind instantly transcended reality and directly broke into the conceptual level. At this moment, the conceptual level was not completely calm. There, countless concepts began to surge wildly. Countless existence concept fragments seemed to be like waves, constantly attacking all the concepts within his sensing range. He did not even need to identify them to know that the wave of concept fragments seemed to be one wave, but was actually divided into 13 waves. These 13 waves of concept fragments formed 13 waves of waves, constantly attacking in all directions and gradually merging with the countless surrounding concepts. And the concepts that were merged with these concept fragments would undergo some subtle changes while growing tremendously. If this change was transmitted to the real level, it would naturally cause those existences to directly forget all the memories related to the 13 sages, and even forget all the memories related to the 13 demon god races. This was the result of the retribution clouds completely destroying all their past, present, and future. Seeing this, Luo Fan did not dare to be negligent at this moment. With a thought, a weak concept of existence appeared in the conceptual plane like a ball. This existence concept was not something else. It was the existence concept corresponding to his consciousness. Compared to his overall existence concept, this concept was naturally insignificant. Naturally, it was extremely insignificant. Normally speaking, a slight tremble from his complete concept of existence would be enough to crush this weak concept of existence. However, at this moment, this existence concept was already his everything. After this existence concept appeared, it naturally emitted some kind of indescribable wave, directly controlling the endless surrounding concepts. As the endless concepts that were under his control began to change the way they welcomed the concept fragments. Previously, these concepts constantly devoured the concept fragments and completely integrated them into their bodies, causing them to constantly grow and transform. However, at this moment, following Luo Fan's thoughts, the way these concepts welcomed the concept fragments had changed. In other words, after devouring the concept fragments into their bodies, they released some other concept fragments in another direction at the same time. Concept fragments constantly collided into them. Concept fragments were constantly being blasted out. The concept fragments that were replaced seemed to be subjected to some kind of indescribable suction force. They began to quickly gather towards the spherical existence concept, perfectly integrating into it. As a result, the concept of the sphere's existence began to continuously strengthen. The whole process was extremely smooth. It felt as if these concept fragments were originally a part of this spherical existence concept. It really works. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. This concept fragment that had been replaced from those concepts was none other than his own concept of existence. In other words, after he endured that punch, his body split into that world and merged with the concept of existence in that world, and the concept of existence that was shattered by that punch. As more and more concept fragments merged into the sphere, Luo Fan felt that his spirit was becoming more and more complete, his own existence itself. His existence itself was also becoming more and more complete. Of course, this was just a feeling. In the real world, his consciousness was still a consciousness, and it did not give birth to anything like flesh and blood. In fact, he did not intend to let his consciousness give birth to flesh and blood so quickly. After all, flesh and blood were insignificant to existences at his level. As long as his concept of existence was intact, his body, his mind, his soul, and even his life essence could be restored at any time, without any damage. Under such circumstances, what was the point of building his own body bit by bit now? In contrast, wouldn't it be better to use this kind of energy to strengthen the replacement effect of the countless existence concepts? As for why he knew that his existence concept had already integrated with everything in this world, he didn't directly devour those concepts. Instead, he used this replacement method to extract his own existence concept. The reason was also very simple. Because after his concept fragments integrated with the concept of everything in this world, after countless years of evolution, they had derived new concepts and new essences. In other words, they were no longer pure to him, and those concepts were no longer completely his existence concept. Under such circumstances, if he were to completely devour the concept of existence of everything in this world, they would obviously weaken his sense of self, causing him to gradually become not himself anymore. This was obviously unacceptable to him. Under such circumstances, replacing his own existence concept with other concepts was also the best and easiest choice. Those concept fragments were transformed from the existence concept of the sage. Such a concept fragment was extremely high in nature, even higher than Luo Fan's existence concept. At such a height, when these concepts of existence fuse with other concepts, they would naturally have a huge impact on that concept, causing every point of that concept of existence to tremble. Only by erupting with the strongest power could the concept of existence be able to completely devour it and fuse with it. In this way, the fragments of Luo Fan's own existence concept would naturally be slightly separated from the other parts of the concept. Then, with the help of the special connection between the concept of existence and the other concept of existence, the attraction was triggered, and the slightly separated concept of existence could naturally be extracted. This was the fundamental principle of the entire replacement process. The existence concepts of the 13 sages were vast and infinite, and the number of them was beyond the limit that could be described by numbers. The high level of their essence had reached an unimaginable level. Even under normal circumstances, without Luo Fan's intervention, it would probably take hundreds of millions of years to completely integrate with the other concepts. Chapter 2024. Although there were occasional twists and turns in the process of fusing the concept fragments, it was still smooth on the whole. Phoenix /Phoenix update fast please search. After all, the root of the countless concepts around him still originated from him. For him, who could advance his mind to the concept level, these countless concepts were clearly within his control. Obviously, for the project of replacing concept fragments, the real difficulty was obviously to separate the fragment of one's own concept of existence from the other derived concepts. In other words, it was to control the concept. With such convenience, some trouble would arise during the process. However, it was ultimately not too big of a trouble, and it would naturally not cause any real impact on him. In Luo Fan's perception, time began to gradually pass. Unknowingly, tens of millions of years had passed. During these tens of millions of years, he did not rest for a single moment. He was constantly replacing countless concept fragments and constantly condensing his own concept of existence. After tens of millions of years, the concept he replaced had unknowingly reached a level that was completely incomparable to before. At this moment, on the conceptual level, the concept corresponding to his original concept of existence had grown to a level that was completely incomparable to before. In this conceptual level, a huge and solid sphere was like a planet in the starry sky. Although it was small, it had an eternal charm, as if nothing could break it and nothing could shake it. Around this concept, the countless concept fragments formed by the 13 sages' concept of existence were like smoke that wrapped around his concept of existence. As it rotated slightly, it constantly swallowed the surrounding concept of existence. After a round of cleansing, it was sent away from the other side of the sphere. In this process, the concepts that were swallowed were completely changed, and the part that belonged to Luo Fan had been stripped away. It had fused into the sphere. It's the end. Suddenly, a kind of enlightenment appeared in Luo Fan's mind. As long as he could replace a piece of his concept of existence, then the concept that belonged to him would instantly break through a certain boundary. This concept of existence that belonged to him would instantly break through a certain boundary, and his instinct to pursue perfection would truly erupt, giving rise to unimaginable power. At that time, this power would easily shatter the boundless concepts in the surroundings and completely strip out the concept fragments that belonged to him. All of them were retracted. At this moment, he felt an indescribable pressure acting on his concept of existence. This pressure came from the boundless concepts around him, and it also came from the concept fragments that wrapped around his concept of existence like smoke at this moment. This is the resistance of heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan had already understood what this oppression was. If he crushed all the surrounding concepts to retrieve his own concept fragments, all the existences corresponding to these concepts would be destroyed in an instant. In other words, the world where his will was, which was almost at the level of a great world, would completely collapse in that instant. It was completely destroyed. Not even a trace of it could be left behind. Such a change could be said to be a change that could destroy heaven and earth. In the face of such an outcome, how could this world sit back and do nothing? It was only natural for it to resist. No matter what, I must retrieve my concept of existence. With such a thought flashing in his mind, Luo Fan's will became incomparably firm, and he directly exerted his most powerful means. He began to carry out the last concept fragment replacement. The moment he took action, the concept of the infinite existences around him instantly changed. All the concepts in his head were completely out of his control in an instant. It was as if all of a sudden, all the concepts seemed to have obtained their own lives, and they began to resist all external forces. In order to replace the concept fragments, one needed to have a strong control over the concept itself. Now that these concepts had broken away from his control and obtained independence, this prerequisite naturally no longer existed. In this case, how could he complete the concept fragment replacement? This was a change on the level of concepts. In reality, the change was even more intense. In the blink of an eye, all the rules and laws in this world exerted their power. Endless power was stimulated from all the space-time in this world and gathered around Luo Fan's will in an incomparably mysterious way. With a slight tremble, his will completely collapsed. Even the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure that had suppressed his will and allowed his will to exist completely shattered into countless fragments. Under the impact of the rules and laws, the fragments spread throughout the world in the blink of an eye and were directly devoured by this world. Luo Fan didn't pay attention to all these changes. It wasn't that he couldn't sense it, but he didn't think there was any problem. A primordial essence spirit treasure, even if it was only a half-step primordial essence spirit treasure, still possessed all sorts of unimaginable mysteries. This kind of change that would be fatal to an ordinary magic treasure was really nothing to a magic treasure of this level. It could even be said to be an ordinary change in form. If he could withstand this wave of tribulations, he could directly gather all the fragments back with a thought. At that time, he would be a complete half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. Even if he couldn't withstand this wave of tribulations, the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure would still continue to gather under its own instinct. In the end, after hundreds of millions of years, it would naturally condense into a half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure. In fact, it wasn't just the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure that had such a special characteristic. Even the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light and other existences of the same level were the same. Otherwise, how could the innate, inextinguishable spirit light, which had always been hidden in Luo Fan's body, disappear along with his body again and again, and reappear with his body again and again? Wasn't it also because the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light also had the special characteristic that no matter how it collapsed or was damaged, it wouldn't cause any harm to itself? Seriously speaking, It was only a change in form. Under such circumstances, how could Luo Fan care about the collapse of the half-step primordial origin spiritual treasure? Wouldn't it be better to use his energy on the concept level to resist the wave of tribulations that was coming from the concept level? On the concept level, at this moment, the entire sea of concepts began to surge. Endless concepts began to combine in various ways. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a boundless sea of thunder and lightning. In the sea of thunder composed of such concepts, every concept had changed its original nature and had produced some kind of change with other concepts that even Luo Fan could not understand, forming some kind of pressure on him that he could not have imagined before. How is this possible? At this moment, this was the only thought in Luo Fan's mind. The change in front of him had almost subverted his view of the world. This was not the reality level, but the concept level. In fact, according to the concept of an ordinary creature, an ordinary cultivator, it didn't exist at all. If Luo Fan hadn't thoroughly understood the essence of the concept in the tribulations, he might not have been able to discover the existence of this concept level with his current cultivation realm. However, on such a conceptual level that could almost be said to not exist, there were all sorts of strange changes that could only be developed on a display level. How could he stay calm? The concept of existence can actually give rise to such changes. Sensing the sea of thunder and lightning in the concept level, Luo Fan felt endless inspiration emerging in his heart. Endless inspiration gushed out from the depths of his heart like a mountain torrent, and his own concept of existence was also violently shaking. At first glance, it seemed that he was afraid of the sea of thunder and lightning and began to tremble under the pressure of the sea of thunder and lightning. The concept in the concept level was different from the concept that Luo Fan had condensed in the imperfect world. Back then, what he had condensed was merely a concept within that perfect world. In fact, it was similar to a rule that transcended the rule of law. It was precisely because of this. Only in that world could the various concepts be condensed into spiritual light, and could they be transformed into various realms. In contrast, the concept that Luo Fan had advanced into was completely different. The foundation of this concept level was actually the concept of existence. Or rather, it was the materialization of existence itself. This was a completely different concept from the divine abilities and powers that had been condensed to the extreme. The reason why it was also called a concept was that Luo Fan didn't have the foresight when he named it. It was also because this was the essence of the concept level that Luo Fan was so shocked by the change in the concept level. To use a more understandable analogy, the change in front of him was like the characteristic of the hardness of metal itself that could actually make obscene jokes. This situation, no matter how one looked at it, was beyond common sense. However, for Luo Fan, what he cultivated was the worldview. Something that could almost shatter his worldview was the most beneficial stimulation for him. It was enough to make his worldview grow by leaps and bounds. Therefore, after recovering from the shock, endless inspiration erupted from his heart. At this moment, the sea of lightning had already begun to produce attacks. A huge lightning dragon rushed out from the depths of the sea of lightning. It charged straight at Luo Fan's concept of existence, which was the ball with a destructive stance. In the air, the lightning dragon twisted crazily. Its claws and fangs flew everywhere, and its body twisted. In the process, it had almost exhausted the limits of its technique. Every move was enough to produce a destructive power that was hundreds of millions of times greater than normal. After the impact, the surrounding sea of lightning could not recover for a long time. It left behind an incomparably mysterious trajectory, which directly pointed at the ball corresponding to Luo Fan's concept of existence. At this moment, facing such a change, Luo Fan's heart trembled. An indescribable power was born from his concept of existence itself. It was an incomparably wonderful magic power. This kind of magic power seemed to exist and not exist. It seemed to be condensed from a certain concept of existence, but it also seemed to be a kind of illusion, an illusory product, However, it was this kind of magic power that exuded an aura that completely belonged to the worldview of laws. With such an aura, this magic power was obviously the Dharma power of laws. Moreover, with such a special characteristic, it was obviously the Dharma power of laws that could only be formed at the conceptual level. After this Dharma power of laws was born, it condensed slightly and formed a huge fist that rushed out of the ball. It directly hit the head of the lightning dragon. The lightning dragon's every move had exhausted the limits of its technique, but it clearly hadn't reached the limit that Luo Fan could deal with. The fist seemed to be without any technique and seemed to be just going straight, but it was not something that the lightning dragon could dodge at all. It was not something that Luo Fan could resist. All the power was poured into the lightning dragon's body without reservation. Following this change, the lightning dragon began to collapse rapidly. Violent shock waves were released from the lightning dragon's body, stirring the surrounding sea of lightning more and more violently, giving birth to all kinds of incomprehensible lights and shadows at this time. The fist formed by the Dharma power of laws at the conceptual level also began to collapse gradually. Finally, when it collapsed to only half of its original size, it barely stopped and formed a new palm. This palm was half the size of the original. It stretched forward and pierced straight into the thundercloud formed by the lightning dragon's explosion. It constantly trembled and shattered the thundercloud, causing the fragments to gradually lose their original form of lightning and transform back into the state of the concept of existence. Then, under the grasp of the giant hand, bits and pieces of the concept of existence broke away from the concept of existence and rushed straight towards Luo Fan's concept of existence. Obviously, these were the concept fragments of existence. They were the fragments of Luo Fan's concept of existence. Such a fragment was much smaller than the concept fragments that he had been constantly replacing for tens of millions of years. It could be said that, normally speaking, it was much smaller. It could be said that under normal circumstances, it would probably take tens of millions of fragments of this size to be comparable to the fragments that he had replaced in the past. It went without saying how low the efficiency was, but Luo Fan's expression was quite calm at this time. He wasn't the slightest bit impatient or discouraged. Being able to extract his concept of existence meant that success was in sight. In comparison, so what if the extraction speed was too slow? For him, even 100 trillion years was no different from an instant. How could he not have this bit of patience when there was no tribulation urging him? Just as the Dharma power of laws at the conceptual level fought with the lightning dragon, or rather, slaughtered the lightning dragon, his spherical concept of existence also began to gradually distort and squirm. Vaguely, it had already started to lose its original spherical shape and was gradually transforming into another shape. Of course, this transformation didn't damage the strength of the concept of existence at all, nor did it damage its ability to withstand external pressure. However, this transformation was fundamentally different from the transformation before it could form sphere. If one had to make an analogy, perhaps the difference between the two was similar to the instinctive transformation of a plasticine creature that could change its form at will and the transformation of a creature that cultivated into a demon. Previously, before the power condensed into the worldview of the world of laws, the unstable form was like the instinctive change of a living creature like plasticine. But now, this ball-like form was gradually transforming into another form. It was as if the living creature had cultivated into a monster and was gradually taking human form. The difference between these two changes was like heaven and earth. Before cultivating into a demon, no matter what changes occurred under the control of instincts, there wouldn't be the slightest change to its essence. A creature would still be a creature, and the limit of its ability would still be at that level. But after cultivating into a demon and beginning to transform, the difference between before and after the transformation was like heaven and earth. Before the transformation, it was just an animal, and after the transformation, it was already a demon. Before the transformation, this creature's level had only reached this level, but after the transformation, it immediately leaped to another level. Luo Fan's concept of existence was constantly changing. When the Dharma power of laws extracted the concept fragments contained in a lightning dragon that belonged to him, his concept of existence had completely changed from its original spherical form to a human form. A human form that looked no different from his body in reality, or rather, the form that belonged to him, the form of his innate Taoist aptitude. It was as if his body in the real world had passed through layers of obstacles and directly entered this conceptual plane. After this body was formed, there was a dazed smile on his face. It was as if he had suddenly comprehended some unimaginable truth, and now he even felt like he was in a dream. With this smile, he gently raised his hand, and those tiny concept fragments directly entered his body. They flowed up and down his body along with the flow of the Dharma power of laws that was being generated in his body. Bit by bit, they were separated and gradually integrated into his body, causing his body, which was already extremely powerful and extremely real, to become even more powerful and real at this moment. Countless terrifying creatures were born in the surrounding sea of lightning again. Chapter 2025. In the face of these countless attacks, the concept of existence that had successfully taken form trembled. He raised his hand and grabbed, and a copper mirror appeared in his hand. After the copper mirror appeared, it exuded an aura that could suppress everything. Under the presence of the copper mirror, the surrounding sea of lightning seemed to be suppressed by an invisible hand. The chaos that was originally chaotic instantly calmed down, and the countless lightning beasts were directly frozen in the sea of lightning, unable to move. Immediately after, mysterious light shone from the copper mirror. With a sweep, the attacks from the countless lightning beasts in the surroundings instantly collapsed. Then it was the lightning beasts themselves. Bit by bit, fragments of the concept of existence continuously emerged from the collapsed lightning beasts. They constantly condensed towards Luo Fan and gradually fused into his body. It's still a little lacking. After fusing the fragments of the concept of existence that belonged to him from the surrounding lightning beasts, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he did not hesitate to turn the copper mirror in his hand. The mysterious light began to change, pouncing towards the surrounding sea of lightning. It began to directly affect the sea of lightning itself, and it began to evaporate the sea of lightning. The endless lightning within the sea of lightning had no ability to resist the mysterious light at all. Like snow meeting the sun, it rapidly melted, and it continuously transformed into its foundation at an unimaginable speed, which was the various concepts. Then, the concepts collapsed, and the concept of existence that belonged to Luo Fan continuously emerged. They condensed towards him. Bit by bit, the concept fragments swept towards Luo Fan's concept of existence like a fog, and were constantly swept up by his power of laws and fused into his body. They enriched his extremely empty concept of existence, and did their best to make up for the lack of the concept of existence. At a certain moment, when Luo Fan's concept of existence finally broke through a certain boundary due to the fusion of the concept fragments, a strange wave was transmitted from this concept of existence. This wave was so mysterious that it instantly spread to the concept level of this area, covering all the concepts of existence in this area. It did not delve deep into it. It resonated strongly with a certain part of those concepts of existence. Amidst the resonance, those concepts continued to collapse, and the complete concept split into countless concept fragments at an unimaginable speed. In the blink of an eye, the entire concept level seemed to have turned into a boundless fog. Immediately after, the bodies formed by Luo Fan's concept of existence opened their mouths and inhaled. A terrifying suction force came out of their mouths and acted on the surrounding fog. Under this suction force, most of the mist did not change. It did not even tremble. But the remaining small portion was like a moth flying into a flame, rushing straight towards his mouth without any regard for anything else. It converged in a frenzy, constantly circulating around his body along with the power of laws at the conceptual level in his body. It gradually fused with his body. This process developed extremely quickly. In just a few breaths, all the changes had completely calmed down. At this moment, Luo Fan's body on the conceptual level already gave off a perfect and complete charm. He quietly stood there, as if a boundless world was occupying this place. The copper mirror in his hand also gave off a feeling of eternity and indestructibility. At this time, there was a kind of eternal and indestructible charm. It was as if the half-step primordial origin spirit treasure had crossed the barrier of reality and truly appeared on the conceptual level. I've finally completely returned. At this moment, Luo Fan gradually opened his eyes. There was a strange expression in his eyes, and there was an indescribable joy in his expression. At this moment, he was the real Luo Fan. Although he had already awakened a bit of his consciousness and could think in his own way, display his cultivation realm, and display all of his power, it was still just a bit of his consciousness. It was not the real him. Only now that all the fragments of his concept of existence had returned, without missing a single thing. His concept of existence had become perfect once more. Only then was he the real him. At this moment, in a real level, the world that had originally reached the level of a great world had turned into a fog that could not be described with words. This fog did not have the distinction of clear and turbid air, nor did it have the distinction of time and space. There were no rules or laws to determine order. There was only a simple fog, a fog that repelled everything else. The reason for this was none other than the fact that the concept of existence in this world should have been shattered on the conceptual level, turned into fragments, and turned into fog. In the real world, a world could display all sorts of strange forms, terrains for basic existences and laws. This was because of all sorts of extremely complicated and mysterious reasons. However, on a conceptual level, it was completely different. On a conceptual level, the reason why this world was like this was because the concept of existence of everything was like this. It was because the concept of existence of everything was different, which caused the scene reflected on the real level to become like this. Under such circumstances, all the concepts of existence on the conceptual level were shattered, causing all the concepts of existence to turn into such a smoky state. Naturally, all existences would be completely confused, causing all existences to lose their forms. Because of that, this part of the world would naturally become like this. It could even be said that the reason why this world still existed and did not completely disappear was because the concept of existence did not disappear on a conceptual level. It was just that the original complete state had turned into this fragmented state. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly. In the real level, in the fog, a figure began to gradually take shape. This figure seemed to have walked out from the conceptual level. It was almost no different from the figure on the conceptual level. Obviously, this was Luo Fan's body. After this body was formed, countless specks of light gathered from all directions and poured into his body. Although each dot of light was extremely dim, there were simply too many of them. With so many light spots and such a fast speed, if they were to completely condense together, they could even turn into the sun and dissolve everything. But as the light spots integrated into his body, Luo Fan did not feel any pressure. Instead, he felt an indescribable satisfaction from the bottom of his heart. When the light spots completely condensed, he waved his hand, and the bronze mirror appeared in his hand, which was the half-step spirit treasure. At the same time, the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light that was like a group of worlds in his body had reappeared. It looked as if his body had never been lost. Even the countless worlds inside and Sky Maiden, who was cultivating in seclusion in the spiritual light, did not feel anything to them. The spiritual light had always been like this. It might not have even moved, let alone disintegrated. Because of this, Sky Maiden could calmly cultivate in seclusion in the group of worlds. If she had known how wonderful Luo Fan's experience was, she would not have let it go. Opening his eyes and looking at the boundless fog around him, Luo Fan frowned slightly. This tribulation, it was not over. The moment he saw the surrounding fog, he was already certain of this point. After all, if the tribulation was over, the surrounding fog would definitely dissipate, and he would definitely return to the Tao Master Path. At that moment, the surrounding fog began to churn. Clear and turbid qi began to separate from the fog. Moreover, they began to continuously condense, gradually turning into clear qi and turbid qi. The same change occurred on the concept level. The countless fragments of the concept of existence kept converging and finally turned into two huge concepts of existence that filled all the areas he saw. Obviously, that was the concept of existence of clear qi and turbid qi. At this moment, Luo Fan's concept of existence, that was the concept of existence that had turned into his body, was sandwiched between the two huge concepts of existence. It was as if heaven and earth were in contact, and he was between heaven and earth. With this change, indescribable power directly oppressed Luo Fan's body, be it in reality or on the concept level. This power was so mysterious and incredible. It didn't just oppress him, it didn't just make him feel that powerful pressure. It was just like the punch he had encountered before. It wanted to decompose him into clear and turbid qi. It wanted to decompose his concept of existence into clear and turbid qi. That punch is still working now. At this moment, Luo Fan had a realization in his heart. The situation in front of him was definitely not a change without a reason. This was the effect of the power of the punch that had descended from the sky back then. Although billions of trillions of years had passed in this great calamity, such a time clearly wasn't enough to completely wear down the power of that punch. I'm no longer the same as I was in the past. At this time, Luo Fan let out such a roar. With a move of his heart, infinite magical power of laws gushed out crazily, condensing into a mysterious light that began to spin frantically around him, producing an incomparably powerful defensive force to resist the powerful attacks coming from all directions. This scene didn't only happen in reality, but also in the concept level. Because he had comprehended the change of form on the concept level, Luo Fan's worldview had undergone an inexplicable transformation, and it was no longer the same as before. Therefore, the law power that was completely derived from law power had also undergone a transformation. He could finally come into contact with the surrounding power that wanted to disintegrate him into clear qi and turbid qi. It was no longer as untouchable as before. For a time, the sound of gaga gaga could be heard, whether it was on the conceptual level or on the physical level. The vortex formed by the mysterious light around Luo Fan's body was constantly being squeezed by an invisible power, and then constantly twisted and deformed. The gaga gaga sound was constantly being emitted during this process. At the same time, blood kept seeping out of Luo Fan's body no matter which level he was on. His entire body began to twist continuously, and it was almost difficult for him to maintain the form of a born Taoism aptitude. This isn't enough. This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, he turned his gaze to his origin of life, which was the materialization of the concept of law there. The starry ball seemed to be under indescribable pressure and began to squirm continuously. It was difficult for it to maintain its original stability. As he watched the changes in the ball, he knew that it was impossible not to change. A thought flashed across his mind. Let's give it a try. Immediately after that, his mind abruptly fused with his origin of life, in other words, his worldview. For a time, he seemed to have transformed into an omniscient and omnipotent supreme existence, as if he understood all the principles in the universe. He understood all the mysteries in his heart. This feeling was enough to make any living creature addicted, but it wasn't enough to make Luo Fan lose his mind. He clearly knew that this feeling was only because the concept of law itself contained the explanation of everything in the universe. The correctness of this completely depended on the accuracy of his concept of law. If he were to really get addicted to it, it would be no different from being deceived by his own lies. Therefore, at this moment, he instantly broke away from this feeling and directly suppressed this omnipotent feeling. Immediately afterward, he took a deep breath. His mind erupted, and his powerful will began to advance into an indescribable realm. It was a wonderful realm that he had reached when he was watching the concept of law take shape. In this realm, his current body, which was the concept of law, began to squirm and gradually change shape. The transformation at this time was obviously completely different from the transformation of concepts that existed on the concept of law before. Although it was difficult to transform concepts on the concept of law back then, it was only difficult to control, and there weren't too many obstacles in itself. However, the transformation now was different. During the transformation, there was an indescribable power that was constantly moving towards the concept of law, distorting it in another direction. This was simply equivalent to dancing on the tip of a knife with shackles on it. How could the difficulty of this be comparable to before? Therefore, he obviously needed to concentrate more energy to maintain this transformation. In the end, he had no choice but to give up on his body on the reality plane. After being invaded by that power, the surrounding vortex gradually collapsed, and the mysterious light within it was quickly decomposed into clear and turbid air, merging into the huge mass of clear and turbid air around him, preparing for the opening of a new world. Immediately afterward, the power that was no longer obstructed by the mysterious light vortex further invaded Luo Fan's body, and it began to gradually decompose and transform his body into clear and turbid air. In the end, all that was left was his worldview, which was still constantly twisting and changing shape within that power. All these changes seemed tragic, but they were all within Luo Fan's control. After all, his body on the reality plane was really nothing to him. As long as his concept of existence on the concept of law was not damaged, he could recover at any time even if his soul was destroyed on the reality plane, and it wouldn't affect him much. Under such circumstances, it was naturally the best choice to give up his body on the reality plane and preserve his concept of existence on the concept of law when he had to gather power. The mysterious light vortex that still existed around the concept of existence that had transformed into his body on the concept of law was the best proof of this. Because he had retracted the energy on his body, the transformation of Luo Fan's concept of law was more resolute and smooth than before. Originally, it might have taken him tens of thousands of years to complete this transformation process. But now, in less than 100 years, his concept of law had already transformed into a human silhouette. Although this human silhouette wasn't very detailed, and it didn't completely transform into the same appearance as Luo Fan's body on the reality plane, it could already be seen that it was Luo Fan's appearance. The moment the similarity between this silhouette and his body broke through a certain limit, countless light spots suddenly shone on his body. The terrifying power that was constantly oppressing him was instantly isolated at this moment, and an indescribable sense of relaxation appeared on this concept of law, as well as in Luo Fan's heart. It seems that this method is really effective. Such a thought emerged in his heart. At this moment, the countless light spots on the human silhouette formed by this concept of law were the light spots that appeared on the surface of the concept of law when it was still in the shape of a sphere. In other words, through various methods, it was determined that this was part of the concept of law that belonged to the perfect world level. However, compared to the past, these light spots were now constantly wandering on the human silhouette. There was an essential difference from the original fixed posture, and it showed a different kind of mystery. If one were to compare these light spots with the innate Tao body, one would know that although these light spots were constantly wandering, the places they were wandering were all the acupuncture points of the innate Tao body. The wandering trajectory of each light spot contained the supreme truth of the universe and some kind of fundamental cultivation mystery. Chapter 2026. In the worldview of Luo Fan, who had already turned into a humanoid silhouette, there were countless densely packed light spots that were constantly swimming in a specific posture. This meant that there were countless incomparably mysterious cultivation techniques and cultivation principles that could support any living being to sublimate themselves to the false sage realm, despair realm, or even the supreme emperor realm. Of course, this only meant that these wandering trajectories had this kind of potential. It also required other kinds of opportunities and the living being's own comprehension ability to achieve that kind of cultivation goal. After all, cultivation could not reach the highest level just by relying on cultivation techniques. As these light spots continued to swim, the outline of the human figure began to become more and more detailed. Finally, at a certain moment, when all the light spots swam to a specific position, an indescribable power was released from those viewpoints. It directly washed over the outline of the human figure countless times, dispelling the bits of impurities within it. In the end, the originally rough position was completely turned into a detailed state, causing the outline of the human figure to turn into a truly perfect appearance that was almost identical to his body in the real world. The appearance that belonged to him, the appearance of the innate Tao constitution. The moment the worldview of laws took on this appearance, the power of laws began to be released from his body frantically. Compared to the original power of laws, this power of laws was at least 10 times stronger in every aspect. Originally, the mysterious light condensed by his power of laws could not resist the power that was constantly attacking him and trying to turn him into clear and turbid chi. But now, just this power of laws alone was enough to form a certain resistance against that power. Under this power of laws, the power that was originally pouncing over endlessly and trying to completely disintegrate his worldview of laws suddenly stopped. At this moment, an indescribable sense of comfort and freedom emerged in Luo Fan's heart. The sense of life and death crisis that was transmitted by the indescribable power around him was instantly reduced by more than half. With this feeling, his heart stirred, and the power of laws began to change rapidly. Specks of indescribable mysterious light appeared under this change and covered the worldview of laws. As the barrier formed by the mystic light was formed, the power was completely isolated. However, it still continued to attack the mystic light. He wanted to break through the barrier of the profound light and disintegrate his worldview. But he couldn't break through this barrier no matter what. Success, he muttered in his heart. He no longer hesitated. Countless specks of light suddenly appeared above his concept of existence. The positions of those specks of light were extremely mysterious, and they were exactly the same as the countless specks of light in his worldview. Even their trajectories were exactly the same, without the slightest difference. With the appearance of these light spots, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable sense of freedom from the concept of existence. Originally, he clearly felt that he still had a huge hidden potential, but he was unable to use it no matter what. At this moment, the sullen feeling vanished into thin air and was replaced by, it was an indescribable feeling of contentment. At this moment, the law power on the conceptual level began to undergo a qualitative transformation, and its quality began to increase crazily. In just the blink of an eye, it had increased to at least 10 times its original level. As it increased to this level, the resistance made by the concept of existence suddenly began to increase as well. The originally barely holding on was swept away and was replaced by a relaxed and casual attitude towards the invasion of the countless powers around him. Under the various evolutions of his law power, the various powers kept retreating, allowing him to have a larger and larger area of stability. As for the concept of existence around him, during this process, it was gradually brought into his control. It was as if he had reformed his own world. His own world. This scene also happened in the real world. In the real world, Luo Fan's body had reappeared, and it looked as if nothing had happened before. His body was still the same as before, and the aura he exuded and the mysterious characteristics he revealed were no different from before at first glance. He was still holding the bronze mirror. It was also as if he would not budge, even if the universe was destroyed. An inexplicable, mysterious light began to spread from his body and spread in all directions, sweeping more and more of the clear and turbid chi into his control. He was constantly dividing a part of the vast and boundless clear and turbid chi that belonged to him. In other words, he was seizing the clear and turbid chi that originally did not belong to him bit by bit. In the past, that fist would have been able to easily shatter him into a state of clear and turbid chi. No matter how much the quality of his profound light had improved, it would still be no match for him, let alone snatch control of the clear and turbid chi from him. However, it was obvious that the current power was no longer the same as when he had punched down previously. Currently, in this tribulation, it was unknown how many trillions of years had passed, and the world that the power had evolved had already been destroyed once during this process. Under such circumstances, even if the nature of the power was incomparably high and had reached a level that even Luo Fan could not understand, it was impossible for it to remain unscathed. It was impossible for it to still be the same as before. It could be said that the current power was many times weaker than the power that erupted from the fist back then. The quality had also decreased due to the flow of time and the birth and death of the world. It was precisely because of this situation that Luo Fan was able to make use of the improvement of the quality of his law power to produce an effect on these powers, blasting them back. However, the power came from that fist after all. It came from the existence that could easily destroy Luo Fan. Even if the quality had been reduced by so much, even if Luo Fan himself was at least 10 times stronger than before, it was still impossible to completely erase this kind of power and completely control all the clear and turbid chis. When the power was pushed back by the mysterious light transformed from his law power, it was actually the power that was constantly shrinking, constantly changing from its originally loose state to gradually becoming solid. Therefore, the more clear and turbid chi Luo Fan gathered, the higher the quality of the power became. It became more and more difficult for him to resist the power. By the time he had separated nearly 10% of the clear and turbid chi, the quality of its power had finally risen to a point where he could no longer move it. He could no longer separate the clear and turbid chi and make it his own. Both. It formed a stalemate where no one could suppress the other. Everything, in reality, was a reflection on the conceptual level. At this time, when the clear and turbid chi in reality fell into such a bottleneck, the concept of the existence of the clear and turbid chi on the conceptual level naturally fell into a bottleneck as well. For a moment, Luo Fan understood in his heart. This is already the limit now. The moment he had this epiphany, the clear and turbid chis began to evolve to the next stage. The collision between the two chis began to give birth to the 4 basic existences of time, space, matter, and energy. It also evolved into countless laws that determined the order of these 4 basic existences and gradually constructed a world, whether it was the clear and turbid chi on Luo Fan's side or the clear and turbid chi within the scope of the power's control. It was the same whether it was in reality or on the conceptual level. After all, the clear and turbid chi was a state that strongly conflicted with each other. There wouldn't be any problems if they came into contact with each other for a short period of time. But if it was too long, the two would inevitably react and give birth to all kinds of things that should exist in the world. This was something that even the power couldn't change, let alone Luo Fan. Therefore, this stalemate between the clear and turbid chi obviously couldn't last long, but it would definitely be broken after a period of time. It would definitely start to evolve the world. As the world evolved, 2 worlds gradually took shape. On Luo Fan's side, the evolution of the world was like a human figure sitting cross-legged in nothingness. Countless light spots representing countless worlds were scattered all over this human figure. It began to gradually revolve around this human figure in an indescribable manner. In the center of this human figure, Luo Fan's body was like the core of this human figure, also sitting there cross-legged. The 2 human figures, one big and one small, faced each other from a distance. appearing incomparably mysterious, as if it contained some kind of transcendental mystery. The human figure formed by this world was none other than Luo Fan's appearance. Or rather, it was the appearance of the world. In contrast, the other world was very ordinary, but it only had the appearance of a normal world. The sky was round and the earth was square. There was a boundless and vast land, and there was also a boundless and lofty sky, with infinite stars and a sun and moon that illuminated all things. However, compared to the world that looked like Luo Fan sitting cross-legged in nothingness, its size was more than 100 times larger. The comparison between the two made people suspect that the world that looked like Luo Fan would be crushed by the world in front of him in the next moment. These two worlds continued to evolve, and life was gradually born. Cultivators gradually appeared, and the world of cultivation gradually grew. On one side was a world made up of countless worlds, big and small, while on the other side was an incomparably complete world. The world of cultivation developed by these two sides was naturally different, and each had its own characteristics. The speed of growth of the world of cultivation was naturally different. The large world developed more steadily, constantly advancing step by step. The level of the world of cultivation was also slowly rising bit by bit. It could be expected that the longer time passed, the higher the level of the world of cultivation would grow. At a certain stage, even sages might be born. In contrast, the world that looked like Luo Fan sitting cross-legged in nothingness was different. In this world, all the worlds were separated. Before the world of cultivation developed to a certain level, each world was in a state of independence. Each world of cultivation had its own characteristics, and it also had its own speed of development. Perhaps, in terms of the overall speed of development, there is not much difference between this world and the complete world on the other side. In individual worlds, however, the speed of development of the world of cultivation was obviously completely different. In some worlds, the speed of development of the world of cultivation was much slower than that of the world on the other side. But in other worlds, the development of the world of cultivation was much faster. In this way, when the world that was developing at a faster speed broke through the barrier of the world and truly stepped into the scope of the world, seeing the whole picture of the world that looked like Luo Fan sitting in nothingness would enter the fast lane of development. The first wave of cultivators who rushed out of the barrier of the world began to use tough means to conquer other worlds. It would begin to use forceful means to conquer other worlds. Like pulling up seedlings to help them grow, it would promote the world of cultivation in other worlds. In the end, it would lead the entire world of cultivation to rise at a speed that surpassed the past. In the end, it gradually suppressed the world on the other side, which was even larger in size. Vaguely, the resources of the countless worlds began to gradually flow in a certain way, causing the entire world to unknowingly seem to come alive. It should be known that the shape of this world was similar to Luo Fan sitting cross-legged in the void. There were countless worlds. The countless worlds were like the countless acupoints on his body. The flow of resources from the countless worlds was like the silhouette of a person beginning to cultivate. For a time, the resources of the countless worlds began to become more and more pure as they flowed. In the end, they were actually turned into resources that promoted the growth of this world, causing the world to gradually grow at an extremely slow speed. Of course, this slow speed of growth had reached an unimaginable level. Even if it was Luo Fan, if he had not been paying attention, he would not have been able to notice this growth. From this, one could see how slow it was. However, no matter how slow it was, growth was growth. This was simply a transformation of the essence of the world, and it allowed this world to transform from a lifeless state to one that was brimming with vitality. At first, Luo Fan did not notice this change. However, after billions of years, when the world of cultivation in this world finally linked all the worlds together, the speed of the flow of resources had reached a point where it could flow between all the worlds with a single thought. This growth had reached a point where it was visible to the naked eye. However, he did not spend any effort on this. He could already easily notice it. There's actually such an unexpected gain. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan was secretly surprised. As an existence like Luo Fan, who explored the essence of cultivation, in the face of this unexpected change, he naturally had to think about the reason behind it. However, since it was an unexpected gain, it was obvious that it would not be so easy to find a root cause. After noticing this change, he spent tens of thousands of years thinking about it, exploring it, and even the instinctive resistance of the two worlds. The cultivation worlds and the two worlds gradually came into contact and began to contradict each other. He did not have the mood to pay attention to the brewing war. However, in the end, he could not figure out the root cause of this change and find the real reason for this change. On this day, Luo Fan sat cross-legged in the center of this world, frowning as he thought to himself, what is the reason? Why can a change in form produce such an effect of self-evolution? Under this inexplicable annoyance, he observed the world up and down, inside and outside. Suddenly, he had a flash of inspiration, and a look of realization appeared in his eyes. I actually forgot this most basic connection. However, he suddenly remembered that the appearance of this world was exactly the same as the form of his worldview. Over the years, although he had been investigating the reason from various angles, he had only been investigating the form of the world, the essence, the route of the flow of resources, and so on. He hadn't spread out from this world, for example, the form of his view of the world, and this was something he should have noticed from the beginning. Although he was secretly dissatisfied with himself for making such a low-level mistake, he did not fall into remorse because of it. Instead, he began to expand from this aspect and began to think about the root cause of the change from this aspect. In fact, this humanoid form was the congenital Taoist body of the Tao Master Great World, the untainted world, and even the Earth universe. However, this did not mean how mysterious this humanoid form was, how many incredible truths it contained, or how many cultivation mysteries it conformed to. It only meant that the creator of these worlds was in this form. In other words, this human form alone was not enough for this world to have such self-evolution and self-improvement characteristics, nor was it enough for his worldview to undergo an earth-shaking change and improve so many times. The reason why his worldview of laws could undergo such a transformation after evolving into the appearance of a born Taoism aptitude was actually very simple. It was because such a change was in line with his soul and his will. It had also truly connected the many bright spots in his worldview of laws, which are the concepts that were definitely at the level of the perfect heaven and earth, into one, and formed a whole. The various improvements that occurred after that, and the various sublimations of the power of his worldview, were fundamentally because of all these, because of himself. But it wasn't because this body contained some kind of inconceivable power, or some kind of unimaginable profundity.